The paper in the Circleville case feels thin beneath your fingers tonight, and as you sit with it by a small lamp, you can almost hear the soft rasp of one old page turning over another. There is no rush here, only the slow work of reading what a town kept seeing and somehow could not quite name. We begin in Circleville, Ohio, where the roads lie open and flat around farm fields, where mailboxes stand at the ends of lanes, and where an unsigned letter could feel, in the quiet of a kitchen, like a voice coming from just beyond the porch light. You can picture the first envelope resting on a table in 1977, its paper slightly bent from the postal bag, its ink dark against the pale surface, its message private and unwelcome. The Circleville case began this way, not with a crowd or a courtroom, but with mail. Roadside. We hold that beginning gently, because it was lived by real people, not characters in a story. Mary Gillispie was a school bus driver, and if you sit with that detail for a moment, you can almost feel the steady rhythm of her days. There would have been early mornings, cool vinyl seats, the smell of diesel near the bus yard, and children climbing aboard with lunchboxes and coats. Her route had a pattern, and patterns can make a life feel safe. Then the letters came, accusing her of a relationship with Gordon Massey, the school superintendent, and telling her to stop. We don't need to raise our voice over that. The words were sharp enough on their own. The letters did not only go to Mary. They reached her husband, Ron Gillispie, and they reached others too, spreading through Circleville like something folded into the ordinary mail. You can imagine someone opening an envelope over the sink, with a coffee cup nearby and the refrigerator humming, then standing still as the room seems to grow cooler. The handwriting became part of the case, the tone became part of the case, and the nearness of the writer became part of the unease. Whoever wrote them seemed to know roads, names, schedules, and habits. As you turn the first page of the file, you notice how plain everything looks from a distance. A town, a route, a family, a rumor, a stack of envelopes. But patient detective work often begins with plain things, because the obvious surface is where most of life happens. In Circleville, the mystery did not hide in a locked room or a distant city. It moved through mail slots, across desks, into kitchens, and along the same roads people used every day. That is part of why the Circleville case went cold in plain sight. Before the investigation could become a case file, it had to become a disruption in ordinary lives, and that is where we rest for a while. You sit now with the early letters, and you let the room settle around them. The paper may have been cheap, the kind that makes a faint dry sound when it bends, and the envelopes likely carried the small marks of handling that postal workers see every day. Investigators would later study wording, spelling, spacing, and handwriting. But at first, these letters were received as intrusions. They were personal before they were evidence. You can feel the difference when you pause over them. The writer seemed fixed on Mary Gillispie and Gordon Massey, and the accusations were repeated with a persistence that gave the letters their own weary rhythm. We should be careful here, because repetition can make something sound more certain than it is. A claim written again and again is still only a claim. In the Circleville case, that mattered. The letters created pressure, and pressure can bend memory, conversation, and suspicion. You can almost hear the low voices in a hallway, the careful pauses at a counter, the way people stop speaking when someone walks in. Ron Gillispie entered the file not only as Mary's husband, but as a man trying to understand who was reaching into his home. Some accounts say he received a phone call that he believed came from the writer. After that, in August of 1977, he left home, and later he was found after his truck struck a tree. He died that night. The detail sits heavily in the file, and we do not need to press on it. We simply let it remain where it is, because it changed everything around it. There were questions after Ron's death, as there often are when grief and uncertainty arrive together. A gun was said to have been found with him, and reports have long noted that it had been fired once. There were also reports about alcohol, and about what he had or had not been doing before he left. You can feel how an investigator would sit with those facts, pencil in hand, not forcing them into one shape too quickly. The air around such a page feels still. The file asks for patience, and patience, in a small-town case, is not a simple thing. People continue buying groceries. Children still wait at the bus stop. The courthouse lights still come on in the morning, and mail still lands in boxes at the ends of lanes. Yet under the surface, the Circleville letters kept working on the town's sense of itself. Someone was watching, or wanted people to believe they were watching, and that belief can be almost as powerful as knowledge. You hold the thought lightly, because fear can travel farther than fact. For a detective reading this many years later, the early period has the feeling of an old room with too many closed drawers. You open one, and it contains Mary's route. You open another, and there is Ron's final evening. Another drawer holds handwriting, another holds rumor, another holds the unsettled question of who had a reason to write. The smell of old paper seems to rise from all of it, dry and faintly sweet. We don't solve anything by hurrying. We keep looking. But the letters did not stay tucked inside envelopes forever, and the next part of the Circleville case moved from private mail into public view. You can imagine a winter road on the 27th of January 1983, when Mary Gillispie was driving her school bus route and saw a sign placed where she would notice it. The air would have been cold, the windows slightly hazed, the steering wheel firm beneath her hands. The sign referred to her daughter in cruel language, and it was positioned along the route as if the writer knew the timing and the road. We will not repeat the words. They do not need our help to be remembered. Mary stopped and went to remove the sign, and there she found a box attached in a way that made the moment part of a criminal investigation. Inside was a firearm rigged so that disturbing the sign could have caused it to fire. We say that plainly, without drama, because the fact is serious enough. In the Circleville case, this was a turning point. The mystery was no longer only paper, ink, and accusation. It had become an object in a field, cold to the touch, built with intention, waiting beside a school bus route. For investigators, that box mattered because objects can sometimes speak more clearly than letters. Paper can be disguised, handwriting can be argued over, but materials may have histories. A firearm may have a serial number. Tape, twine, cardboard, and placement can suggest habits or access. You can picture the careful hands of an officer lifting and securing evidence, the quiet click of a camera, the stiff winter grass underfoot. The scene was outside, but the work had the hush of an archive before the archive existed. That firearm was eventually traced to Paul Freshour, who had been connected to the Gillispie family by marriage. He was Mary's former brother-in-law, and his name would become one of the central names in the Circleville case. The evidence seemed to offer investigators something solid after years of anonymous writing. Here was a person, here was a connection, here was an item that could be followed backward. You can understand why attention settled there, even as the larger files still had more pages than answers. Freshour denied being the writer and denied responsibility for the device. Still, the case moved toward him, and in 1983 he was arrested. In 1984, he was convicted of attempted murder and given a prison sentence. You can sit with that sequence without rushing to certainty. The justice system had made a finding, and yet the old letters had a way of resisting any simple closing of the drawer. In a quiet case file, verdicts and doubts can sometimes share the same folder. The physical evidence was important, but the handwriting was important too. Samples were compared. Experts were asked for opinions. Investigators tried to connect marks on paper to the movement of one person's hand. You can see the pages laid side by side under a lamp. Loops and slants examined, pressure and spacing studied with patient eyes. There is something almost intimate about handwriting evidence. It asks whether a person's private motion can betray them, even when the name is left unsigned. Yet handwriting can also become a difficult kind of evidence, because every letter on a page carries both habit and performance. A writer may disguise, a nervous hand may change, a copied style may imitate certainty, while hiding doubt. As you read through the Circleville case, you learn to slow down around anything that looks too neat. The old file may offer a direction, but it rarely offers comfort. We keep one hand on the page, and we keep the other on the possibility that a page can mislead. When Paul Freshour went to prison, some people might have expected the letters to stop. And that expectation is where the case begins to grow strangely quiet again. You turn the page, and the prison years feel like a long corridor with fluorescent light overhead and polished floors underfoot. Freshour was confined, watched, counted, and moved through routines that were documented by people whose job was to know where he was. Yet letters connected to the Circleville writer continued to appear while he was incarcerated. That fact has kept the case unsettled for decades. It did not erase the conviction, but it kept a door open in the minds of many who returned to the file. A person reading the case late at night might pause here, because this is one of the places where plain sight becomes difficult. If the writer was in prison, how were letters still moving through the world outside? If the writer was not in prison, then what had the investigation really captured? You can hear the soft scrape of a chair as a detective sits back and considers both questions without answering them too quickly. The file does not reward impatience. It asks you to stay. There were explanations people could consider. A person in prison might find ways to send messages through others. Another person might copy the style. A separate writer might have existed from the beginning, close enough to the circle of suspicion to keep the voice alive. We do not need to choose tonight before the evidence permits it. The calm work is to let each possibility sit in its proper place, like envelopes arranged across a desk in careful rows. The letters themselves had a certain public quality by then, even when they were privately received. Circleville had become a town where anonymous words were part of local memory. People could talk about them at work, at home, in cars, and in the spaces between errands. You can imagine the smell of rain on a windshield, the quiet thump of wipers, and someone saying they had heard of another letter. That is how a case can become both known and unsolved. Everyone can see its outline, while the center remains empty. For investigators, the continuation of letters raised practical problems. Each new envelope needed to be preserved. Each mark might matter. Each postmark, each phrase, each odd spelling could become a small part of the map. But evidence that arrives over years can also become heavy. Boxes fill, officers transfer, memories soften. The original urgency becomes a routine check, then a note, then a file label with dust along the edge. You can feel the weight of that slowness in your hands. Still, someone cared enough to keep the papers. That matters. Cold cases survive because somebody, somewhere, decides a thing should not be thrown away. An envelope is kept instead of discarded. A report is filed instead of forgotten. A name is written clearly enough for a later reader to find it. In the Circleville case, the long survival of the mystery depends partly on that humble labor. It is not dramatic work. It is the work of cabinets, folders, and patient clerks. Years passed, and the town kept living around the mystery, which is often how old cases become harder to see. You can sit with Circleville as a real place now, not only as a name attached to letters. It is in Pickaway County, south of Columbus, with roads leading out toward farms and small communities, where the horizon can feel broad and the sky can seem to rest low over the fields. In town there are storefronts, sidewalks, traffic lights, and the ordinary sounds of daily life. A case like this does not float above those things. It is woven through them, quietly and sometimes inconveniently. That ordinary setting is part of the answer to why the Circleville case went cold in plain sight. The writer did not need a hidden castle or a secret room. They used mailboxes, gossip, school routes, and the normal trust that lets a town function. You can almost feel the cold metal flag on a rural mailbox, raised or lowered by a hand no one notices. The system was built for everyday messages. The writer used that everyday system as cover. Small towns can remember, but they can also protect themselves by not looking too long at one painful thing. A person still has to stand in line at the grocery store. A bus still has to arrive. A family still has to sit down to dinner under a kitchen light that buzzes faintly when the house is quiet. We should not judge that too harshly. People have to live inside uncertainty. And sometimes living means setting the question down for a while. Investigators, too, live inside limits. They need evidence that can stand in daylight. They need witnesses who can say what they saw, not only what they suspect. They need timelines, materials, and connections that remain firm when pressed. In the Circleville case, suspicion was plentiful, but suspicion is not the same as proof. You can write that distinction in the margin of the file and return to it often. It is one of the quiet laws of patient detective work. The writer seemed to understand the power of uncertainty. Anonymous letters create a strange imbalance. The writer can accuse, observe, and suggest, while everyone else must answer from inside the open world, with names attached and reputations exposed. You can feel the unfairness of that as you read. The paper is light, but the effect is not. A few lines in an envelope can change the temperature of a room, especially when nobody knows whose hand made them. By the time Freshour was released in 1994, the Circleville letters had become a long shadow over many years. Accounts say the threatening letters stopped around that time. That timing, like so much else, can be read in more than one way. Some saw it as meaningful, others saw it as another unanswered detail. You and I place it carefully on the table, not as a solution, but as one more object with edges, weight, and silence. But an old case does not end just because the letters stop arriving, and the next folder is the one filled with memory. When you read a case like this after many years, memory becomes both a guide and a fog. People remember how a voice sounded on a phone, how an envelope looked, how a neighbor behaved, or what someone said in a room where the curtains were drawn. Some of those memories may be clear, some may have changed with retelling. In the Circleville case, the human memory around the letters became almost another archive, stored in kitchens, living rooms, and quiet conversations. Mary Gillispie's experience remained central because she was there at the beginning and at the roadside sighing. We should keep her humanity in view. She was not merely a name in a mystery. She was a woman who drove a school bus, lived in a community, carried family grief, and became the focus of an anonymous campaign. You can imagine the texture of her work jacket, the smell of bus exhaust on a cold morning, the small fatigue that comes from being watched by someone unseen. Gordon Massey also became part of the public shape of the case, because the letters named him again and again. That is one of the cruel powers of anonymous accusation. A name can be repeated until it feels attached to a story, even when the truth beneath it remains difficult to handle fairly. We do not need to decide more than the evidence allows. We only need to recognize that the letters pulled real people into a public uncertainty that lasted for years. Paul Freshour's place in the Circleville case is equally complicated. He was convicted in connection with the roadside device, and that legal fact remains part of the record. He also maintained his innocence, and the continued letters during his imprisonment gave later readers a reason to question whether the whole truth had been reached. You can sit with both facts at once. A patient file allows that. It has room for official answers and lingering doubt. The case grew colder, not because nobody could see it, but because too many visible pieces could not be made to fit securely. The letters were visible. The sign was visible. The trial was visible. The continuing mail was visible. Yet visibility is not the same as clarity. In the soft light of this file, you begin to understand that plain sight can be crowded, and crowded things can hide each other simply by standing too close. There is a quiet lesson in that, one that belongs to many cold cases. The most important clue is not always hidden far away. Sometimes it sits among ordinary facts, handled so often that its edges wear down. A postmark, a phrase, a road, a family connection, a timing detail. You can return to these again and again, and each time they may seem almost ready to speak. Then they settle back into paper, so we move slowly, not toward an ending yet, but toward the patient middle of the Circleville case, where the files sit open and the town goes on breathing around them. You sit with that patient middle, and the table before you seems to widen with every folder you open. The Circleville case has a way of doing that, spreading from one envelope to another, from one kitchen to another, until the town itself feels like part of the file. You can almost smell dust warming under a lampshade, and you can hear the faint click of a pen being set down between notes. Nothing here moves quickly. The case has always asked for slower hands. When we look at why the Circleville case went cold in plain sight, we have to begin with how visible the letters became. They were not hidden relics found years later in a basement drawer. They moved through ordinary mail, through real routes, through a town where people recognized last names and trucks and family ties. You can picture the envelopes arriving with utility bills, school notices, and grocery flyers. That ordinary company may have made them feel almost unreal, as if something so strange could not really belong to the same stack. The writer understood the small architecture of daily life. A mailbox at the road is not a locked vault, and a letter does not ask permission before entering a home. You and I can pause over that simple fact because it explains much of the case's strange durability. The writer did not need to appear in person. The writer could wait inside paper, folded flat, silent, until opened. In Circleville, the mystery walked in through the most normal door there was. For investigators, that meant the evidence began in a soft and perishable form. Paper can be handled before anyone thinks of fingerprints. Envelopes can be torn, folded, stacked, or set beside a sink. Ink can fade, and memory can begin to shape the moment of opening before anyone writes a report. You can imagine an officer asking when the letter arrived, who touched it, where it sat, and whether anyone else had seen it. Each answer would matter. Each answer might already be blurred. The letters also carried a social force that evidence rooms cannot easily contain. They pushed suspicion outward, into conversation, and once suspicion is spoken aloud, it starts gathering other material. Someone remembers an argument. Someone recalls a strange look. Someone says a person always knew too much. You can hear how that would sound in a small office or across a diner table, with cups touching saucers and chairs scraping quietly on tile. The paper had become public before the writer was known. That public quality made the Circleville case feel solvable, at least from a distance. If so many people knew about the letters, then surely someone knew who wrote them. If the writer knew local details, then surely the writer must have stood close enough to be identified. Yet the closer you read, the more difficult that confidence becomes. Knowing a town does not narrow a suspect list as neatly as it seems. In a place where lives overlap, many people know many things. You begin to see the first coldness forming there, not in neglect, but in abundance. There were too many connections, too many small histories, too many reasons a person might know a route, a name, or a rumor. The Circleville case did not go cold because it vanished. It went cold while everyone was still talking about it. You can feel how frustrating that would be for a detective, sitting with a yellow legal pad, drawing lines between names until the page looks full but not clear. And when a page grows too full, the next patient step is to return to the basics, to the ink, the paper, and the hand that made the words. You turn back to the handwriting now, and the file becomes quiet in a different way. Handwriting evidence asks you to look closely, almost tenderly, at marks someone never expected to be studied by strangers for decades. There are loops, angles, slants, pressure marks, uneven spaces, and little habits that may feel as personal as a voice. You can picture magnifying glass edges catching the light, a ruler laid gently beneath a line, and two pages resting side by side on a felt-covered table. The Circleville writer's hand became one of the case's central mysteries. Experts examined samples and compared them with known writing, and at trial those comparisons helped shape the case against Paul Freshour. But handwriting is a human thing, and human things can resist clean measurement. A person can disguise a style. A person can imitate another. Stress can change a line. Age can soften a hand. We have to let the evidence remain evidence, not more and not less. As you read, you may feel the temptation to treat handwriting like a fingerprint. It is comforting to imagine that every person leaves an unmistakable pattern, but handwriting has always lived closer to judgment than certainty, especially in older cases where the standards and tools were different from what a later reader might expect. You can smell the old paper and ink as you think about it, and you can hear the thin sound of a page sliding from a folder. The past had its methods. It also had its limits. Those limits mattered in the Circleville case because the letters were not one or two clean samples collected under ideal conditions. They were many communications spread over time, with varying levels of handling, storage, and attention. Some were preserved carefully. Others entered memory before they entered evidence. You can imagine a stack of photocopies, some darker than others, with margins clipped or shadows near the fold. A detective working through them would not have one perfect object. They would have a trail. The language itself also became a kind of handwriting. The writer repeated ideas, returned to certain accusations, and used a voice that people came to recognize. You and I can read that voice without giving it too much power. It was insistent, personal, and controlling. It wanted to be feared. Yet even that tone may not identify a single person as clearly as it seems. Anger can be performed. Cruelty can be copied. A style can become a mask. This is one of the soft traps in a long investigation. Once a voice is familiar, every new line may be heard through that familiarity. If a later letter sounds similar, it may confirm the pattern. If it sounds different, someone may say the writer was disguising themselves. You can feel how easily a case can fold inward that way. Each explanation protects the larger theory. Each exception is absorbed. The file grows heavier, and the center remains unsettled. So we leave the handwriting pages where they are for a moment, and we move toward the people around the case, because in Circleville, paper and family were never far apart. The family connections in the Circleville case are the kind that make an investigator slow down. Paul Freshour was connected by marriage to the Gillispie family, and that connection gave the case both proximity and complication. He was not a stranger drifting through town. He belonged near enough to be noticed, remembered, and compared against old tensions. You can imagine a detective writing a family tree on a pad, then adding arrows, question marks, and dates until the diagram begins to feel more like a thicket than a map. The Gillispie family had already been through Ron's death, and the letters had already placed pressure on Mary's life. Into that strain came suspicion, investigation, and eventually prosecution. We should be careful with every name here. A cold case file can make people look flatter than they were, because it records only what the case needed from them. Yet each person had mornings, habits, private worries, and rooms where they sat when no one was taking notes. You feel that if you read slowly. When Paul Freshour was accused, the case seemed to find a shape that could be presented in court. The firearm traced to him mattered deeply. The handwriting comparisons mattered. The connection to the family mattered. The state argued its case, and a jury convicted him. You can picture the courthouse atmosphere, not as a scene of drama, but as a place of wooden benches, paper files, low voices, and shoes moving softly across a polished floor. The law must make decisions from what can be shown, but outside the courtroom, the Circleville case remained less settled. Freshour continued to say he was innocent. Letters continued while he was imprisoned. People debated what that meant. You can sit with the discomfort of that, because it is exactly the kind of discomfort that keeps a case alive long after a verdict. A conviction may close a legal proceeding. It does not always close the minds of people who see loose threads still hanging from the file. Those loose threads did not appear in one neat bundle. They appeared as small questions. How much access did Freshour have to the firearm before it was used in the roadside device? Could someone else have obtained it? How reliable were the handwriting conclusions? Who benefited from the accusations continuing? Why did the letters persist under conditions that seemed to make Freshour an unlikely source? You do not have to answer each question tonight. You only have to notice how they gather. As we follow those questions, the room around the file becomes very quiet. The old case asks you to accept that legal certainty and historical certainty can differ. One belongs to the courtroom with rules, burdens, and final judgments. The other belongs to the long work of memory, evidence, and later doubt. In the Circleville case, those two kinds of certainty never rested easily together. That is part of why the mystery kept its shape. And when a case keeps its shape after a conviction, attention eventually moves beyond the courthouse and into the long public memory. Years later, the Circleville case reached people who had never driven those roads or opened a mailbox in Pickaway County. It became known through retellings, television coverage, articles, and conversations among people drawn to old unsolved questions. You can imagine the file leaving the town in a figurative way, copied into scripts, clippings, and late-night discussions. Yet the wider attention did not solve it. Sometimes public knowledge adds light, and sometimes it adds reflections that make the original glass harder to see through. For listeners far from Circleville, the case can feel almost like a puzzle. Anonymous letters, a roadside device, a death, a conviction, and letters continuing from prison all seem to invite arrangement. But for the people inside it, the case was never just an arrangement of clues. It was a series of lived disruptions. You and I need to keep returning to that. The paper edges may feel delicate now, but when they first arrived, they cut into real days and real relationships. Public fascination also has a way of smoothing rough facts into a few memorable points. The Circleville case becomes the letters case, and Paul Freshour becomes the convicted man who said he did not do it, and Mary becomes the bus driver watched by an unknown writer. Those summaries are useful, but they are not enough. When you sit with the file, you notice the worn corners between those summaries. You notice the time gaps, the uncertainty, the ordinary grief, and the waiting. Waiting is one of the least dramatic parts of investigation, and one of the most honest. Detectives wait for lab work. Families wait for phone calls. Reporters wait for records. Witnesses wait for memory to sharpen, though it often softens instead. In Circleville, the waiting stretched across years, then decades, until the old envelopes became artifacts from another era of phones, mail, and local life. The sound around the case changed from ringing landlines to quiet computer keys, but the central question stayed. You can feel the technology changing around the file. In the late 70s and early 80s, the mail carried weight in a way it does not always carry now. A letter could dominate a day. A postmark could matter. A phone call could leave little behind except memory, and a note in a report. There were no doorbell cameras collecting the passing road, no easy digital trails for every movement. Investigators worked with paper, statements, physical traces, and the slow geography of a town. That older world gave the Circleville writer room. The writer could know things by watching, listening, hearing gossip, or simply belonging to the overlapping circles where information moved. You can picture a payphone, a kitchen wall phone, a counter where mail is sorted, and a car idling near the shoulder of a rural road. None of these things are remarkable alone. Together, they form the quiet background against which the case unfolded. The mystery lived in the ordinary machinery of its time. The wider world could look in later, but it could not recover every small moment that had passed unrecorded. That is one reason old cases harden, not because no one cares, but because time removes the soft material between facts. Tone disappears, context thins, people move away, change their minds, or pass on. The remaining file may be thick, but certain living textures are gone. You can still smell the paper, but not always the room where it was first read. So we return once more to the town itself, because Circleville was not only the setting of the case, but the screen on which the writer kept projecting suspicion. A town like Circleville has many kinds of visibility. People may notice whose porch light is on, which car is parked where, and who stops too long near a driveway. Yet that visibility is uneven. It can show everything except the thing most needed. You can imagine standing on a sidewalk in the late afternoon, with traffic passing slowly and a courthouse bell marking the hour, and still not knowing which nearby person wrote the letters. Plain sight can be strangely private. The writer used that unevenness with skill, or at least with persistence. They named people. They implied knowledge. They suggested that they were watching. Each letter widened the circle of unease while keeping the writer hidden at the center. You and I can see how effective that would be in a close community. The more everyone wondered, the more everyone watched each other, and the less the writer had to do. Suspicion became a kind of unpaid messenger. This is one reason the case went cold in plain sight. The mystery did not remain a clean line between writer and victim. It became a web of reactions. People responded to the letters, discussed them, feared them, dismissed them, repeated them, and remembered them. Every response left another mark on the public understanding of the case. You can almost hear paper being shuffled across a desk as a detective tries to separate the original act from all the echoes that followed. Echoes are difficult evidence. Someone may remember hearing a rumor before a letter arrived, but another person may remember the reverse. Someone may recall that a phrase sounded like one neighbor, while someone else hears a different hand in it. The sound of a voice, even on paper, is subjective. You can hold two accounts beside each other and feel how both might be sincere. The file does not become simpler, because people are honest. Sometimes, honesty brings more complexity. The roadside sign in 1983 stands out because it was physical, specific, and tied to a place. It was not merely an echo, it was a constructed object along Mary's bus route. Yet even there, questions remained. Who placed it? When was it placed? Who knew the route well enough to choose that location? Who had access to the materials? You can smell damp grass and cold air around that scene, and you can feel the stiffness of a winter morning settling into your sleeves. The object seemed to point toward Paul Freshour because of the firearm's history, but pointing is not the same as explaining everything. A piece of evidence may connect to one person while still leaving open how it arrived where it was found. Investigators often live in that difference. They do not only ask what an object is, they ask how it traveled. In the Circleville case, that path became one of the central questions later readers continued to revisit. And as the years moved on, the question of travel became larger because the letters themselves kept traveling. You sit now with the letters that came after the conviction, and the file seems to exhale with a long, tired breath. These later letters are among the reasons the Circleville case never settled fully into the past. If the right man had been convicted, then the continuing letters required explanation. If the letters came from someone else, then the earlier investigation had not reached the full truth. You can feel how each possibility keeps the file open by just a narrow crack. Some people believed Freshour could still have been involved from prison, directly or indirectly. That possibility cannot be brushed aside simply because it is inconvenient. Prison walls restrict a life, but they do not erase every connection to the outside. Messages can move through visitors, acquaintances, or other channels. You and I can acknowledge that without turning it into certainty. In careful detective work, a possibility is not a conclusion. It is a shelf where evidence may or may not eventually belong. Other people believed the continuing letters showed that another writer had always been responsible. That idea also had weight for many who studied the case. If someone else had imitated the style, then why continue? If someone else was the original writer, then why did the case land where it did? Questions like these do not clang loudly. They sit quietly, like stones in a coat pocket. You carry them from page to page, feeling their weight even when you are reading something else. There is also the possibility of more than one hand, more than one motive, or a pattern that changed over time. Old cases sometimes resist the clean shape we want from them. The beginning may not match the middle may not explain the end. A person may start something another person later copies, or a rumor may become a script for someone else's anger. In the Circleville case, the long span of letters makes such possibilities hard to ignore. Yet every added possibility also makes proof harder. A detective cannot charge a cloud of possibilities. A prosecutor cannot ask a jury to convict a fog. The law needs a person, an act and evidence strong enough to carry the burden. You can feel the gap between mystery and proof opening here. It is a quiet gap, but it is wide. Many cold cases live inside it, not because nobody sees the pieces, but because the pieces never form a bridge. As you keep reading, your eyes may rest on the postmarks. They are small official stamps, the kind most people glance past. In a case of anonymous mail, they become little clocks and maps. They tell when and where a letter entered the system, though not necessarily who placed it there. You can imagine a postal counter, the smell of paper dust, the soft thud of mail being sorted into bins. The writer passed through that system and left almost nothing of themselves behind. That almost is important. Cold cases often turn on an almost enough handwriting similarity, almost enough motive, almost enough timing, almost enough connection. In the Circleville case, there were many almosts, and for a time, they were enough for a conviction on the roadside device. But the broader question of the writer remained harder to hold. You can see why the public memory never fully let go. The case was both answered and unanswered, depending on where you placed your finger. When a file contains that kind of tension, later investigators and readers tend to return to the same pages, hoping the old facts will rearrange themselves. You return now to Ron Gillispie's final night, because no careful reading of the Circleville case can pass over it too quickly. He was Mary's husband, and he had received letters. Accounts say he left home after a phone call, apparently believing he knew something about the writer. Later, his truck was found after it struck a tree. He died as a result of the crash. We keep the details spare because respect requires restraint. The question around that night is not only what happened, but what people believed had happened. Belief can shape an investigation from the first hour. If Ron thought he was going to confront someone, then the call matters. If he had been drinking, that matters too. If a firearm was present and had been discharged, that becomes another fact needing a place. You can picture the report pages, the typed lines, the officer's notes, and the edges where grief presses against procedure. For Mary, Ron's death became part of the same long shadow as the letters. For investigators, it added seriousness and difficulty. For the town, it gave the anonymous writer an even darker place in local memory. Though the official understanding of the crash has not transformed the case into a simple solved narrative, you and I must keep our wording careful here. It is easy, from far away, to overconnect facts because they feel emotionally connected. Patient work asks us to separate feeling from proof. The weather of that night, the road conditions, the timing of the call, and the movement of Ron's truck all belong to the kind of reconstruction detectives know well. They would ask who spoke to him last, what he said, what he carried, and where he intended to go. They would listen to the tone of witness statements, while also knowing tone is fragile. You can imagine the smell of damp roadside earth, the quiet flash of emergency lights, and the heavy silence after questions stopped being answered. Over time, Ron's death became one of the facts that made the Circleville case feel larger than anonymous harassment. It gave the story sorrow, and sorrow can draw people toward a case while also making them less careful with it. We should not let that happen. We can acknowledge the sadness without turning it into spectacle. A man died. A family was changed. A file received pages that could never be made light again. That is enough. As the years passed, those pages would be read and reread by people trying to understand whether Ron's death belonged directly to the writer's campaign or stood beside it in a more complicated way. That uncertainty is painful because it does not let grief choose a clean direction. You can feel why families in cold cases often ask not for drama, but for clarity. Clarity gives grief a room to sit in. Without it, grief wanders the halls. The Circleville case kept wandering, too, moving between letters, roads, family, court, prison, and memory, and each place added another layer of dust to the same unanswered center. If you were the detective tonight, sitting alone with the boxes, you might begin making a timeline. You would start in 1977, with the first letters to Mary and Ron. You would place Ron's death in August of that year, and you would leave space around it, because the questions there do not fit neatly into a single line. You would continue through years of letters, then mark the roadside sign in January of 1983. The page would already feel crowded. Then you would add Paul Freshour's arrest, trial, conviction, and imprisonment. You would mark the letters reported during his confinement. You would note his release in 1994. You would write that the threatening letters appear to have stopped around that period, and you would underline the word appears, because old cases often require modest words. The timeline would look like progress, yet when you leaned back, you would see that the central name was still missing. The writer had not signed. Timelines can bring comfort because they make time behave. They place one thing after another, even when life felt chaotic to the people living it. But a timeline does not prove motive. It does not show what was said in a room with no recording. It does not recover the exact movement of a hand placing a letter into a mailbox. You can hear the soft graphite sound of your pencil as you add a question mark. The timeline helps. It does not finish the work. Still, it reveals something important about why the Circleville case stayed visible and cold. The events were spread out enough to become familiar, but not continuous enough to keep one sharp investigative moment alive forever. Years create gaps. Gaps weaken memory. Memory weakens pressure. Pressure is often what causes a witness to come forward or a small inconsistency to be pursued immediately. Without steady pressure, even a public mystery can drift toward the edge of active attention. The town, meanwhile, had its own timeline. Children grew older. Drivers changed routes. Families moved houses or repaired them. Mailboxes were replaced. Roads were resurfaced. A kitchen where one letter was opened may have been repainted, remodeled, or sold. You can picture all those small changes, each ordinary and harmless on its own, slowly covering the original landscape of the case. The mystery remained known, but the world around it kept changing. That is how coldness enters. Coldness does not always feel cold at first. Sometimes it feels like routine. Another month passes. Another lead fades. Another officer is assigned elsewhere. Another file is placed back in the drawer. The metal handle of the cabinet is cool under the fingers, and the drawer closes with a low, final sound, though everyone knows it can be opened again. In the Circleville case, it was opened again, many times. The answer still did not step out. When the next box comes down from the shelf, it brings us to motive, and motive is one of the softest and most dangerous materials in the room. Motive feels like it should explain everything. If we know why someone wrote the Circleville letters, we imagine we might know who wrote them. But motive is often hidden even from the person acting on it. Anger, jealousy, control, shame, fear, righteousness, and resentment can braid together until no single strand can be named. You can feel how carefully we need to move here. A motive guessed too early can become a lantern that only lights one corner. The writer's letters focused on Mary Gillispie and the alleged relationship with Gordon Massey, but that focus does not automatically tell us why the writer cared. Perhaps the writer believed they were exposing something. Perhaps they wanted to punish. Perhaps they wanted power over people who had not given it to them. Perhaps the accusation was partly a cover for another grievance entirely. We do not need to settle on one. We simply note that the letters returned again and again to control. Control is present in the way anonymous letters behave. The writer sees but is not seen. The writer speaks but does not answer. The writer demands action while avoiding conversation. You can imagine how that imbalance might feel to the recipient, holding a page with no face behind it. The kitchen clock ticks. A car passes outside. The paper feels too light for the weight it carries. That is the quiet cruelty of the form. For investigators, motive can help narrow a field, but it can also widen it. Many people might have opinions about an alleged affair. Many people might resent a school official, a family member, a neighbor, or a town's social order. Many people might know enough to sound informed. In Circleville, where personal and public lives overlapped, the writer's knowledge did not automatically point to one person. It pointed to a circle, and then another circle around that one. That is where plain sight becomes almost blinding. Everyone is close enough to know something. Everyone is far enough to deny knowing too much. A bus route is public in one sense, private in another. A school superintendent is a public figure locally, but his personal life is not public evidence. A family dispute may be known by many and understood by few. You and I sit with these distinctions because the case depends on them. The writer's motive also may have shifted over time. What begins as a personal accusation can become a performance of power. Once people respond, the response itself may feed the behavior. The writer may have watched the town react and felt, in some distorted way, confirmed by that reaction. We cannot know that with certainty, but we can see how the letters created an arena in which the writer remained hidden and others were forced into view. The next page in the file does not answer motive, but it reminds us that every anonymous act creates two stories: the story the writer tells and the story the evidence can prove. The story the Circleville writer told was one of certainty. The letters spoke as if the writer knew, judged, and had the right to command. That kind of voice can be persuasive, especially when it arrives repeatedly and seems to contain private detail. But the evidence story is slower. It asks how the writer knew, whether the writer truly knew, and whether the writer's claims were accurate or merely useful. You can feel the difference between those two stories in the space between paragraphs. Investigators had to work with the evidence story. They could not simply accept the writer's confidence as truth. They had to ask what was observable, what was corroborated, and what might have been invented to cause harm. You can imagine a detective drawing a line through an unsupported claim, not to dismiss it entirely, but to keep it from contaminating firmer facts. That is patient work. It is also quiet moral work. because it protects real people from being swallowed by accusation. This matters especially in a case where the letters themselves are part of the harm. Repeating the writer's claims can become a second delivery of the same envelope. We do not need to do that. We can say the letters accused Mary and Gordon without turning the accusations into the center of our attention. The real center is the act of anonymous control and the long failure to identify the hand behind it. That is where the Circleville case remains most haunting in its calm way. You might notice that the case asks us to care about absence, the absent signature, the absent confession, the absent witness who could say, "Yes, I saw the letter being written," the absent piece that would align the conviction, the continuing letters, and the roadside device into one stable picture. Absence can be hard to narrate because it has no color or sound. Yet, in a cold case file, absence often takes up the most room. It takes up room in the boxes too. Blank spaces appear where a modern investigator might hope for DNA, digital records, surveillance footage, or preserved trace evidence. The late 70s and early 80s left different kinds of records. There were typed reports, photographs, physical objects, recollections, and official forms. You can feel the paper grain under your thumb, and you can smell the slightly metallic scent of old filing cabinets. The past is available, but only in the form it left behind. That form shaped every later attempt to understand the case. People could revisit the handwriting. They could review the trial. They could interview surviving participants and compare stories. They could ask whether the letters from prison truly changed the meaning of the conviction. But they could not turn the old world into a new one. A cold case is not only a mystery about who acted, it is also a record of what the era could capture. And when the era could not capture enough, the case became something people carried as a question rather than closed as an answer. You can imagine the question moving through Circleville over the years in softer and softer forms. At first, perhaps, it was immediate and raw. Who wrote this? Who knows something? Who could be watching? Later, it may have become a story told to someone new in town, or a memory brought up when old cases were discussed. The voice lowers. The details become familiar. The mystery remains, but it no longer arrives fresh in the mailbox. It becomes part of local atmosphere. That atmosphere can preserve a case, but it can also blur it. A well-known local mystery may be repeated so often that people feel they know it even when they only know its outline. You and I have to resist that ease. The Circleville case is not only a handful of striking facts. It is also the accumulation of uncertainty around each fact. The more calmly we read, the more we notice how much of the case depends on timing, interpretation, and trust. Trust appears everywhere in the file. Mary had to decide whom to trust with the letters. Investigators had to decide which accounts to trust. Jurors had to decide whether the evidence against Freshour could be trusted beyond the required standard. Later readers had to decide whether the continued letters should change their trust in the verdict. You can feel trust moving through the case like a thread pulled through cloth. Sometimes it holds, sometimes it tightens. The anonymous writer exploited trust by refusing to participate in it. They demanded belief without accountability. That is one reason the letters felt so invasive. A signed accusation can be confronted. An unsigned accusation floats. It can land anywhere, then lift again, leaving people to argue with a blank space. You can picture a page lying open on a table, its corners slightly curled, and the room around it feeling larger than before. The blank signature is a kind of silence. Silence also surrounded the person who may have known. In many cold cases, there is a persistent idea that someone, somewhere, carried the answer. That idea may be true. It may be only a comfort, because it suggests the truth still exists in a human place. In the Circleville case, it is easy to imagine one person at a kitchen table, or in a car, or at a desk, knowing more than they ever said. But imagination is not evidence. We let it remain imagination. Still, detectives often work by respecting imagination without obeying it. They allow themselves to ask what might have happened, then return to what can be shown. You can do the same tonight. Let the possible scenes rise gently, then let them settle back into the file. The lamp is steady. The pages are patient. The case does not demand that every thought become a theory. It only asks that every theory answer to the paper. And the paper, after so many years, keeps leading us back to the same strange fact. that the Circleville writer was both everywhere and nowhere. Everywhere, because the letters reached homes, public officials, and the broader town. Nowhere, because no one could stand in front of the writer and ask a question. Everywhere, because the accusations touched reputations and routines. Nowhere, because the hand behind them remained hidden. You can feel the balance of that as you read. It is not dramatic, it is exhausting. The mystery wore people down by staying present without becoming reachable. That kind of presence can make an investigation seem more active than it is. If letters keep coming, then something is happening. If people keep talking, then the case feels alive. But activity is not the same as progress. New envelopes may repeat old claims. New conversations may recycle old suspicion. A file can grow thicker without becoming clearer. You can see why a detective might feel both busy and stuck, surrounded by motion that does not move the answer closer. In the Circleville case, the road from suspicion to proof was especially rough because the writer's acts were scattered. A letter here, a letter there, a sign years later, a trial, more letters. Each piece had to be tied to a person, and tying one piece did not automatically tie them all. You can hear the patient frustration in that. The file is not empty. It is simply unwilling to become one thing. It keeps remaining several things at once. This is where the title's phrase, "cold in plain sight," begins to feel less like a contradiction and more like a description. The plain sight was the mail, the roads, the talk, the family connections, the court record, and the public attention. The coldness was the missing certainty behind all of it. We see the stage, the props, and the marks on the floor. We do not see the person stepping forward to explain their hand in the script. Yet we should not treat that missing person as the only human being who matters. The people who endured the letters matter. The people who endured the letters matter. The people who investigated matter. The people who preserved records matter. The jurors, officers, postal workers, family members, and later readers each held a small part of the case's long life. You and I are only late visitors to the file. We arrive after much has already been carried. That humility helps keep the tone where it belongs. We are not here to outguess everyone who lived closer to the events. We are here to sit with the record, notice its unresolved places, and understand how a case can be both famous and unfinished. The Circleville case teaches that visibility is not the same as knowledge. It teaches that repetition is not proof. It teaches that a town can know a mystery by heart and still not know its answer. Years after the first envelopes, the physical world of the case had changed enough that even the familiar roads held a different kind of silence. You can imagine driving through Circleville long after the letters stopped, with newer signs, different cars, and fresh coats of paint on buildings that once stood under the same questions. The fields would still open beyond town, and the mailboxes would still wait near the road, but the people passing them might know the case only as something from before. That is how time covers a place without erasing it. The old story remains under the surface, like a line visible beneath thin paint. For a cold case investigator, that changed landscape matters. A route driven in 1983 may not feel the same decades later. A roadside marker may be gone. A tree may have been cut down. A house may have new owners who know nothing about the letters once discussed at its table. You can feel how difficult it is to reconstruct a lived geography from old descriptions. Maps help, photographs help, but they do not return the air. The air is what witnesses carry, and witnesses age. Their memories may remain sincere while losing edges. A person may remember fear more clearly than sequence, or a face more clearly than a date. They may remember what they later learned as if they knew it earlier. That does not make them dishonest. It makes them human. You and I should hold witness memory gently, like old paper that may tear if pulled too hard. In the Circleville case, memory has had to carry a heavy load. People remember letters, calls, suspicions, conversations, and impressions of who seemed capable of what. Some of those memories were recorded close to the time. Others entered later retellings. A careful reader separates them when possible, though the separation is never perfect. You can imagine sorting papers into piles by date, then finding one undated note that matters too much to ignore. The file resists neatness again. That resistance can make people impatient. They want the one clue, the one overlooked line, the one person whose name makes everything settle. But old mysteries often do not give themselves away so cleanly. They ask for a different kind of attention, slower and more tolerant of incompleteness. As you sit with Circleville, you begin to feel that attention settling into your hands. You stop demanding that every page solve the case. You let each page say only what it can. This may be the kindest way to read a case that harmed real people. We do not turn their uncertainty into entertainment. We do not make their fear louder than it was. We notice the facts, the gaps, and the patient work done around them. We let the old envelopes keep their dry whisper. We let the town remain a town, not merely a backdrop, and we keep moving forward, one page at a time. The next page brings us back to evidence storage, because every cold case eventually becomes a question of what was kept and what can still speak. You can picture an evidence room with metal shelving, cardboard boxes, paper tags, and the faint smell of dust and adhesive. Somewhere in such rooms, cases become quiet, without disappearing. They wait in folders, envelopes, bags, and record systems that change over time. A detective may retire, but the box remains. A clerk may move the file, but the label still names the case. In the Circleville case, the survival of letters and reports has allowed later readers to return to the mystery again and again. Preservation is humble work, and it rarely receives the attention it deserves. Someone has to file the envelope. Someone has to log the object. Someone has to keep a record legible enough for a person decades later to understand it. You can feel the weight of that labor in the simple fact that we can still talk about specific dates, names, and events. Without those quiet acts, the Circleville case would have dissolved into rumor. Instead, it remains partly anchored. But preservation is never complete. Some items may be missing. Some records may be incomplete. Some evidence may have been handled according to standards that later generations would find too casual. We should not say that with blame in our voice. Every era works with its own habits and expectations. Still, the result matters. A cold case inherits every choice made before it was cold, including choices nobody knew would matter so much later. If investigators today looked back at the Circleville case, they would think differently from investigators in the early 80s. They might ask about trace evidence, chain of custody, forensic document analysis standards, postal records, and the exact provenance of each item. They might wonder whether any envelope could yield more than it once did. Yet they would also face the plain limits of age. Paper degrades, handling accumulates, opportunities pass quietly and do not return. That is another way a case goes cold in plain sight. The evidence is visible, but its best moment has passed. A letter remains, but the fresh surface is gone. A witness remains, but the memory has traveled through many years. A road remains, but the original conditions are lost. You can hold the evidence and still feel time between your fingers. The past is present, but it is not fully available. The file therefore becomes a conversation between what remains and what is gone. You read what remains. You respect what is gone. You do not fill every empty place with certainty just because the mind dislikes silence. The Circleville case has too often tempted people into confident theories, and confidence can be soothing in the wrong way. Tonight, we choose the steadier comfort of patience. We allow the unknown to stay unknown where the record requires it. And once we accept that, the public fascination with the case begins to look different, less like a search for thrills, and more like a long effort to tolerate an unfinished sentence. People return to the Circleville case because it sits close to ordinary life. Many mysteries feel distant, wrapped in unfamiliar places or rare circumstances. This one begins with mail, roads, work, marriage, rumor, and a community's sense of who knows what. You can understand why it lingers. Anyone who has opened an unexpected letter knows the small pause before reading. Anyone who has lived in a close place knows how quickly talk can travel. The case turns those ordinary experiences slightly sideways. That nearness also explains why the case can feel so unsettling without needing any dramatic description. The letters entered normal spaces. The kitchen table, the bus route, The mailbox. The school community. You can almost feel the paper lying beside a salt shaker or a set of keys too close to daily life to be dismissed. The mystery did not arrive wearing a mask. It arrived with postage. That is why its plainness matters. For the sleepy listener, there is something almost meditative in following such a case slowly. You are not being asked to chase, you are being asked to notice. Notice how an accusation moves. Notice how evidence becomes complicated by handling. Notice how a conviction can answer one question while leaving another open. Notice how time changes the value of every detail. The Circleville case rewards that kind of noticing, because its loudest facts have always been surrounded by quiet ones. One quiet fact is that the writer needed readers. An anonymous letter without a reader is only paper. The writer depended on Mary opening the envelope, Ron receiving the message, others reacting, and the town absorbing the claims. That dependency is worth noticing. The writer seemed powerful, but the power required participation from the very people being harmed. You and I can see the sadness of that. The recipients had to carry the messages before anyone could investigate them. Another quiet fact is that the writer's knowledge may have been less extraordinary than it appeared. In a town with overlapping lives, many details can be learned without secret access. A route can be watched, a rumor can be overheard, a schedule can be guessed, a name can be repeated until it sounds like inside knowledge. This does not mean the writer was far away. It only means nearness can be easier to perform than we assume. The case keeps teaching caution. A third quiet fact is that certainty often arrived from outside the letters, not inside them. The firearm, the trial, the prison letters, and the continued public attention all shaped the case more firmly than the writer's accusations ever should have. That is important. The letters may have caused the harm, but the investigation had to look beyond their voice. You can feel the difference between listening to a claim and investigating the act of making it. The second task is slower and more honest. As the night deepens around the file, we begin to see that the Circleville case is less a single locked door than a house full of half-open ones. One door opens onto Mary's daily routine, the bus route with its repeated turns and familiar stops. Another opens onto Ron's final evening, where grief and uncertainty make the room feel colder. Another opens onto the roadside sign, with its physical evidence and alarming placement. Another opens onto Paul Freshour, the conviction, the denial, and the questions that followed him into prison and beyond. You can stand in the hallway of this old house of facts, and hear each door move slightly in the quiet. No one door contains the whole case. That is part of the difficulty. If you focus only on the letters, the roadside device feels like a separate escalation, needing its own explanation. If you focus only on the conviction, the prison letters trouble the edge of the answer. If you focus only on the prison letters, the physical evidence still waits to be accounted for. The Circleville case stays cold because every path asks you to carry another path with you. Detectives know this feeling well. A theory explains 3 things neatly, then stumbles over the 4th. Another theory explains the 4th and weakens the first 3. You can imagine notes being rewritten, arrows erased, a coffee cup cooling beside the folder. The work is not glamorous. It is mental patience, repeated again and again. A good investigator learns not to fall in love with the theory that explains only the most dramatic page. That may be why the case remains so instructive. It shows the difference between a mystery that lacks clues and a mystery with clues that do not settle. The Circleville case is not empty. It is crowded. Its coldness comes from the crowding, from the way facts, interpretations, and public memory press against each other. You can see almost everything people usually ask for in a case, and still the identity of the writer remains unproven in the broad public mind. The phrase "in plain sight" also asks us to think about social blindness. People see what their relationships allow them to see. A family member may be easier to suspect or harder to suspect, depending on the history. A respected person may be protected by reputation. A disliked person may seem guilty too quickly. A town may know a truth and still lack the conditions to say it aloud. These are delicate thoughts, and we hold them without forcing them into accusation. In Circleville, anyone close enough to know the right details may also have been close enough to benefit from doubt, loyalty, fear, or habit. That does not point to one person. It points to the social weather of a small community under strain. You can almost feel that weather in the pauses between statements, in the careful words people choose, and in the way a room changes when a name is mentioned. Investigation is not only facts, it is atmosphere too. And so we keep listening to the atmosphere, because sometimes the quietest part of a case tells you why it remained unsolved even when so many people were looking. The quietest part may be the ordinary courage of people continuing their lives. Mary continued living under the weight of the case. Families continued around absence and suspicion. Investigators continued with other work, other calls, other files. The town did not stop being a town. You can picture morning light on sidewalks, mail trucks moving through neighborhoods, and school buses starting their routes while the old mystery remained somewhere in the background. Life does not wait for answers. That continuation can make an old case harder to revisit. When people have spent years surviving uncertainty, a new question can feel like reopening a drawer they had managed to leave closed. A detective calling decades later may be doing necessary work, but the person answering may hear old discomfort in the receiver. You and I can respect that. Cold case work often asks people to remember what they worked hard to carry quietly. The Circleville case also asks how much harm can be done by words. The letters were made of ink and paper, but they altered behavior, reputation, trust, and memory. They produced fear without needing to stand in the room. That is why the case belongs in patient detective work. It is not only about identifying a writer, it is about understanding how anonymous words can move through a community and leave marks that outlast the paper itself. In a police file, harm may be easier to document when it leaves a physical trace. A damaged object, a medical record, a photograph, a recovered item. But social harm leaves traces in changed routines and guarded conversations. You can hear a person become careful. You can see curtains close earlier. You can feel a family stop speaking freely near the phone. Those traces are real, though they are difficult to collect in evidence bags. The Circleville letters lived partly in that difficult category. That difficulty may have helped the case grow cold. The writer's acts were persistent, but much of their effect was atmospheric. Atmosphere matters deeply to people who endure it, but it can be hard to present as proof. The law asks for specific acts tied to specific actors. The community feels the wider pressure. Between those two realities, some part of the truth can remain unclaimed. You can sit with that gap without needing to fill it. The old file now feels less like a puzzle box and more like a weather record. It contains storms, clearings, pressure changes, and long stretches where the air was simply heavy. The Circleville case was visible because everyone could feel the weather. It went cold because feeling weather is not the same as naming who made it. That sentence sits quietly on the page. We do not underline it too hard, but there is still more to turn over, and the next pages ask us to think about how a community handles an answer that never fully arrives. A community handles an answer that never fully arrives by learning to live beside it. And that may be one of the hardest truths in the Circleville case. You can imagine people speaking about the letters in lowered voices at first, then later in the tone people use for old troubles that have never been settled. The story remains, but the edge changes. It becomes part warning, part memory, part local history, and part open question. The unknown does not leave. It simply becomes familiar. Familiar mysteries can be difficult for investigators because familiarity creates grooves in the mind. People begin to know which names will be mentioned. They know which events will be retold. They know where the conversation usually stops. You and I can feel how that would happen in Circleville. After years of letters and years of retelling, a new investigator might arrive with fresh eyes, but the town would already have well-worn paths through the story. Fresh eyes still have to walk carefully through old footprints. Those old footprints include the conviction of Paul Freshour, which sits in the file like a heavy book on a shelf. It cannot be ignored, and it cannot be made to answer everything by force. Freshour was convicted in connection with the roadside device, and that remains part of the legal record. Yet the broader identity of the Circleville writer remained debated, partly because the letters continued while he was in prison. You sit with that tension because the case asks you to. The public mind often wants a single sentence. The writer was this person, the case was solved, or the wrong person was convicted, and someone else walked free. But real files often do not allow such clean sentences. They hold partial findings, contested interpretations, and facts that lean in different directions. You can hear the soft hum of an evidence room light as you think about that. The file is not arguing loudly. It is simply refusing to become simpler than it is. For the people who lived through it, that refusal had consequences. Certainty can let a community rest, even if the certainty is painful. Uncertainty keeps people looking over their shoulders, or looking back through memory, wondering whether they misunderstood someone they knew. In the Circleville case, the unknown writer remained close enough in imagination to disturb trust. You can feel how a town might keep functioning while carrying that quiet disturbance. Grocery lists are still written. Mail is still opened, but something has changed. That is why patient retelling matters. If we move too quickly, the case becomes a string of curiosities. If we slow down, we see a community trying to carry an unresolved fact without letting it consume every ordinary hour. You can imagine the smell of coffee in a local restaurant, the scrape of boots near the door in winter, and an old conversation returning after someone mentions a name. The Circleville case lived in those small returns. It was not always active, but it was never fully absent. As the file moves outward from the town, we come to the people who tried to make sense of it later, people reading the case from a distance through screens, articles, recordings, and old television segments. Later attention gave the Circleville case another kind of life. People who had never seen the roads began to study the letters, the trial, and the odd timeline with the care of late-night readers leaning close to a desk. You can picture someone far from Ohio, in a quiet apartment, scrolling through a retelling while rain taps against the window. The case travels well because its central objects are familiar. A letter, a mailbox, a road, a family dispute, a question that will not settle. But distance changes a case. From far away, the town can become symbolic, and the people can become roles. Mary becomes the bus driver. Ron becomes the husband who left after a call. Freshour becomes the convicted man who insisted on innocence. Gordon Massey becomes the named official in the letters. These descriptions help organize the file, but they can also flatten living people into case functions. You and I need to keep breathing life back into the names, quietly and carefully. The wider audience often returns to the letters that continued during Freshour's imprisonment, because those letters feel like the hinge of the mystery. If you are reading the file tonight, that hinge may creak softly each time you reach it. The continuation does not automatically prove one theory, but it opens space for doubt. Doubt is powerful in a cold case, especially when it attaches to something as visible as ongoing mail. It gives the mystery a second room. Some readers imagine an accomplice. Some imagine a copycat. Some imagine that the original investigation narrowed too quickly. Some imagine Freshour somehow remained connected from behind prison walls. Each theory tries to explain the same stubborn fact. You can let them pass like slow shadows across the table, one after another, without inviting any of them to sit permanently in the chair. The calm work is not to choose the most satisfying answer. It is to ask which answer the evidence can actually bear. That is where public fascination can become fragile. A satisfying answer may feel true because it has rhythm. It explains the strange parts, gives the story a shape, and allows the reader to close the file in their mind. But evidence does not care about rhythm. It cares about connection, timing, custody, opportunity, and corroboration. In the Circleville case, the most satisfying story is not necessarily the most provable one. You can feel the discipline required to accept that. The discipline is gentle, but it is real. You read a paragraph, then ask how the writer knows it. You hear a claim, then ask whether it comes from a report, a witness, a later recollection, or a retelling. You see a connection, then ask whether it is evidence or atmosphere. That may sound dry, but it is a form of respect. It keeps the people in the case from being rearranged for our comfort. It lets the record breathe, and when the record breathes, it brings us back to the postal system, that quiet network of hands and bins through which the Circleville letters moved. Mail is intimate and impersonal at the same time. A letter has a destination chosen by one person, but it passes through the hands of people who do not know the private meaning of what they carry. You can picture canvas bags, sorting slots, rubber bands, stamped dates, and the smell of paper dust in a workroom. The Circleville writer used that system like a hallway, walking through it without being seen. The envelope arrived as if it belonged with everything else. For investigators, mail creates both clues and limits. A postmark can place a letter within a broad geography and time. A stamp might carry traces. An envelope might preserve handwriting, adhesive, or handling marks. But a letter dropped in a public box does not say who dropped it. The postal system is designed to protect the movement of ordinary messages, not expose the person behind each one. You can see how the writer benefited from that ordinary privacy. In the late 70s and early 80s, that privacy was stronger in practice than it would feel today. There were fewer cameras, fewer digital records, fewer automatic trails left behind by daily movement. A person could drive to a box, drop a letter, and leave almost no trace beyond memory, if anyone noticed at all. You can hear the metallic flap of a mailbox closing in the evening air. It is a small sound. In this case, it echoes for years. The writer may have mailed letters from different places, or may have chosen times and locations with care, or may have simply relied on the anonymity built into routine. We cannot know each choice, but we can understand the cover provided by normal life. Nobody watches a mailbox constantly, because there is usually no reason to watch it. Nobody studies every person buying stamps. The writer moved through a system that trusted ordinary behavior to be ordinary. That trust is beautiful in normal times. It lets strangers carry birthday cards, bills, school forms, and handwritten notes without suspicion. The Circleville case reminds us that ordinary trust can be misused, but it does not make trust foolish. It only shows how deeply investigations depend on the small assumptions society makes every day. You and I can hold that thought without bitterness. The mail carried harm in this case, but the mail itself was only the road. The road matters because the writer's anonymity depended on movement. They had to write, fold, address, stamp, and send. Each step was an opportunity to leave a trace, and each step apparently passed without revealing enough. You can imagine a detective reconstructing those steps late in the day, while the office grows dim around the window. Where was the paper bought? Where were the envelopes kept? Who had time? Who had privacy? The questions are simple, the answers are not. From the mail, we drift back toward the physical act of writing, because before any letter entered the system, someone sat with a page and chose to begin. There is something revealing about the act of writing by hand, even when the writer tries to hide. A hand must move line by line. The body must remain with the thought long enough to make it visible. The Circleville writer returned to that act again and again, producing not one impulsive note, but a long pattern of written intrusion. You can picture the table, the pen, the pressure of the hand, and the pause before the envelope is sealed. That repeated act suggests time and privacy. Whoever wrote the letters needed moments away from interruption. They needed access to addresses, details, and enough calm or fixation to keep composing. You can almost hear a house at night, a refrigerator clicking on, a chair shifting, and paper moving under a wrist. These are imagined sounds, of course, not evidence. But they help us understand that anonymous writing is still a physical behavior done by a person in a real room. Investigators often look for habits in repeated behavior. Does the writer use the same phrases? Do they misspell the same words? Do they press harder when angry? Do they place the address in the same position on each envelope? You and I can see why those details mattered. A repeated act may reveal what a single act hides. Yet if a writer is cautious, or if the letters were handled unevenly, the pattern may never become strong enough to identify them beyond doubt. The content of the letters also suggests a writer invested in being obeyed. They did not merely report what they claimed to know. They commanded, warned, and tried to shape conduct. That is important. The Circleville case is not only about information, it is about pressure. The writer seemed to want people to change under the weight of anonymous scrutiny. You can feel that pressure in the way the letters kept returning to the same human targets. Pressure creates responses, and responses create more evidence, though not always the kind investigators can use. A person might avoid a route, confront a family member, speak to police, or tell a friend. Each response moves the case outward. The writer may then react to those reactions, sending more letters or changing targets. You can see how a feedback loop forms, quietly and stubbornly. The file becomes not just a record of acts, but a record of reactions to acts. That loop may have helped the writer remain hidden. When many people are reacting, the origin becomes harder to distinguish from the echoes. A later rumor may sound like the original accusation. A frightened guess may sound like insider knowledge. A copied phrase may sound like the writer's voice. In Circleville, the letters created an environment where information could become contaminated by repetition. You and I keep returning to that because it matters deeply. And once information becomes contaminated, a cold case investigator must sort not only facts from lies, but early facts from later knowledge. You can imagine a witness being asked, years later, when they first heard a certain detail. The witness may answer honestly and still be wrong. They may remember the detail clearly, but not the date when it entered their mind. This is not a failure of character. It is how memory works under pressure and time. The Circleville case, with its long public life, is especially vulnerable to this. People learned things over years, then carried them back into older memories. A detective reading such statements has to ask careful questions. Did this person know the detail before the letter? Did they learn it from the letter? Did they hear it after the trial? Did a television program or newspaper retelling shape the memory? You can feel the patience required. The questions are not accusatory. They are protective. They protect the file from becoming a mirror that reflects only what later people already believe. In a case that became widely discussed, this sorting grows even harder. Public retellings can preserve facts, but they can also standardize a story. Once a version becomes familiar, people may unconsciously align their memory with it. You and I have to acknowledge that gently. A community story can be sincere and still edited by time. The old evidence must therefore be read with attention to when each piece entered the record. Dates become quiet anchors in moving water. The date of the roadside sign, the 27th of January 1983, is one such anchor. It fixes a public act to a winter morning and a bus route. The death of Ron Gillispie in August of 1977 is another. The conviction of Paul Freshour in 1984 is another. His release in 1994 is another. These anchors do not solve the case, but they keep it from drifting completely into legend. You can feel their usefulness under your hand. Between the anchors lie stretches of uncertainty, letters arriving, people talking, investigators comparing, family tensions changing, public attention rising and falling. Those stretches are where the case breathes, and where it also becomes hard to prove. The Circleville case is not only the fixed dates, it is the long space between them. You can almost hear that space in the quiet between pages, when the lamp hums and the room feels still enough for an old question to return. Old questions return differently depending on who asks them. A legal reader may ask whether the conviction was supported. A family member may ask who caused years of distress. A local historian may ask how the town remembers the case. A cold case investigator may ask what evidence could still be tested or re-examined. You and I, tonight, ask why the case went cold in plain sight. The answer lies not in one door, but in the whole house. That house grows larger when we consider how the case balanced private pain and public curiosity. Private pain moves differently from public curiosity. Public curiosity wants details. Private pain wants room to breathe. The Circleville case has lived between those two needs for decades, and a gentle retelling should feel that tension. We can look closely without taking more than the case can give. We can name the facts without making them sharper for effect. You can imagine closing your hand lightly over the edge of a page, keeping it still while you read. That is the pace we need. Mary's experience should remain central without becoming spectacle. She was repeatedly targeted by letters and was placed under a kind of pressure most people never have to imagine. She also had a life beyond the case. and we should leave space for that life. The file can only show us part of her experience. It does not tell us every morning she woke, every conversation she had, or every ordinary task she completed while the mystery continued around her. We remember that. Ron's death should remain sorrowful without becoming a device for tension. He was a person before he was a turning point. The file records his place in the sequence, but it cannot contain the full weight of his absence. You and I can let the room stay quiet around his name. In old case work, restraint is not emptiness. It is how we acknowledge that some facts belong partly to families, not only to readers. Paul Freshour's role should also be handled carefully. He was convicted, he served time, and he maintained his innocence. Those facts can sit together without our voice becoming combative. The case around him has been debated for years, and the debate remains part of the public life of the Circleville mystery. You can see how one man's legal status became tangled with the larger unanswered question of authorship. The file holds him firmly and uneasily at the same time. Gordon Massey's name entered the case because the letters made it part of the campaign. That too requires care. Being named by an anonymous writer is not the same as being understood. Public accusation can attach itself to a person in ways that outlast evidence. We can say that the letters alleged a relationship, while remembering that the writer's purpose may have been to damage, control, or force a reaction. The accusation itself is not a reliable narrator. When we treat each person with that care, the case becomes less noisy and more human. The mystery does not shrink, it deepens. You can feel how a calm file differs from a sensational one. In a calm file, every name has weight, and every unknown is allowed to remain proportionate. The Circleville case has enough strange facts on its own. It does not need our voice to lean on them. And because the facts are strange enough, we can return now to the roadside device with the same patient steadiness we bring to the letters. The roadside device is the part of the Circleville case that most clearly changed the investigation's character. Before it, the letters were frightening and invasive, but they were still made of words. With the sign and box, the case gained a physical object placed in Mary's path. You can picture the winter roadside, the brittle grass, the grey light, and the silence around a school bus paused on its route. That silence feels important, but we do not make it theatrical. The object was built in a way that suggested planning. It was not a passing remark or an angry sentence written in haste. It required materials, assembly, placement, and knowledge of where it would be seen. Investigators could therefore examine it as a deliberate construction. The firearm within it became central because it could be traced. In a case full of anonymous paper, traceable metal must have felt like something solid beneath the hand. Yet solid evidence can still lead to difficult questions. An object traced to someone does not always tell the full story of how it was used. Chain of possession matters. Access matters. Opportunity matters. The time between ownership and placement matters. You and I can feel why the jury found the evidence important, and we can also understand why later readers continued to examine its path. Good faith attention allows both observations to remain in the room. The placement along Mary's route also points to knowledge. Whoever put it there seemed to know where she would pass and what kind of sign might make her stop. That knowledge narrows the imagination, but it may not narrow the suspect list as much as we want. School bus routes can be observed. Local people may know them. Family members, neighbors, parents, and others may learn patterns without formal access. Once again, the case offers nearness without identity. The object's discovery also depended on Mary's decision to stop. That is a chilling fact, but we hold it softly. She saw something about her daughter, and she responded as a mother and as a person responsible for a bus route. The writer, or the person who placed it, appears to have counted on that response. You can feel the unfairness of that, without needing to describe it sharply. It was a manipulation of care, and care should never have been used that way. For investigators, the roadside scene would have required immediate practical work. Secure the area, preserve the object, document the sign, speak with Mary, trace the firearm, look for witnesses, ask who had passed that road, who might have seen a vehicle stopped, who had access to materials. You can imagine notebooks opening, breath visible in cold air, and the low murmur of officers trying to be thorough. The work would be methodical, because it had to be. The case moved from that winter road into court, but even after court, the road remained in the public memory as a place where the mystery became tangible. Tangible moments are powerful in cold cases because they seem to promise an answer. You can touch an object, you can photograph it, you can trace part of its history. Compared with anonymous language, a physical device seems less slippery. The Circleville case needed that kind of solidity, and for a time, the roadside evidence provided it. It helped move suspicion from a broad, uneasy atmosphere toward one accused person. That is what physical evidence can do. But physical evidence does not erase the earlier years. The letters before the roadside incident still required explanation. The continued letters afterward required explanation. The writer's knowledge, tone, and persistence required explanation. You can think of the roadside device as a heavy stone placed in the middle of the file. It weighs down the pages around it, but it does not flatten every page into one meaning. Some edges still lift in the quiet air. This is why later doubt gathered around the case rather than disappearing. People could accept that the device was important and still ask whether the writer was fully identified. They could accept the conviction and still wonder whether another person wrote some letters. They could recognize the strength of one piece of evidence while questioning the whole architecture built around it. You and I do not need to resolve that debate here. We only need to understand why it endured. A case goes cold when the remaining questions outlive the available tools. In Circleville, the available tools were handwriting analysis, witness statements, physical tracing, local knowledge, and court proceedings. Those tools produced a legal result in one part of the case. They did not produce a universally accepted answer to the authorship of the letters. The difference may seem narrow, but it is wide enough for decades of uncertainty to pass through. You can feel that width tonight. The word authorship matters. We often use it for books, essays, and letters of ordinary meaning, but here it carries a different weight. Who authored the campaign? Who authored the fear? Who authored the public accusations and private distress? The Circleville writer was not simply a person holding a pen. The writer created an atmosphere and kept returning to it. To identify authorship would be to name the source of that long pressure. And because the source remains uncertain in the broader public understanding, the case continues to be reread as a lesson in how evidence can be visible yet incomplete. Visible yet incomplete is a phrase that suits many objects in the Circleville file. The handwriting is visible, but identity remains disputed. The firearm history is visible, but the full path of use remains questioned by later readers. The letters from prison are visible, but their meaning is debated. The town's awareness was visible, but the writer remained hidden. You can place each item on the table and see it clearly, then still not know how the items lock together. That experience can feel frustrating, but it is also honest. Cold case work is often the practice of resisting false completion. A detective may feel pressure from the public, from families, from supervisors, or from their own fatigue to make a set of facts settle. But the facts have to settle on their own weight. You can imagine a detective late in a career, reading the Circleville file again, sighing softly, then turning back to the first letter because the beginning still matters. The beginning matters because the first letters set the pattern. They show what the writer wanted people to believe, whom they targeted, and how they chose to communicate. If the beginning could be understood clearly, perhaps the later acts would align more easily. But beginnings are often the least documented parts of old cases. People do not know they are living the first page of a file. They may throw away an envelope, touch a page, or wait before reporting because they do not yet know the scale. That is another quiet reason the Circleville case became difficult. Early acts may not have been treated with the full preservation later investigators would wish for, simply because no one could know what the letters would become. A first strange letter may seem like a cruel nuisance. A second may seem connected. A 10th begins to look like a campaign. By then, some of the earliest evidence may already have passed through too many hands. Time starts working against the case before the case is fully recognized. You can feel the sadness in that, because it is not anyone's simple failure. It is the natural delay between harm beginning and people understanding its shape. Many cold cases contain that delay. The first moment does not announce itself as historic. It arrives as a phone call, a missed appointment, an odd letter, a thing slightly out of place. Only later does everyone look back and say, there, that was where it started. The past rarely labels itself. In Circleville, the past labeled itself gradually, one envelope at a time. Each letter added weight. Each reaction widened the circle. Each new report made the file more real. Yet by the time the pattern was undeniable, the writer had already learned how to remain hidden inside it. You and I can see the trap only because we are reading backward. The people living forward had no such advantage. Reading backward can make us too confident, so we pause again and let the file remain humble beneath our hands. Humility is useful in the Circleville case because so much of it depends on interpretation. Was a phrase unique or common? Was a handwriting similarity meaningful or overstated? Was a continued letter proof of another writer or evidence of outside assistance? Was a remembered conversation reliable or shaped by later events? Each question has possible answers, and each possible answer changes the room slightly. You can feel the file shifting as you move one small detail from one pile to another. A humble reader also remembers that old investigations were done by people under real constraints. They had limited time, limited technology, and the pressure of public concern. They had to make decisions without the comfort of hindsight. It is easy, decades later, to say what should have been done differently. Sometimes that criticism is fair. Sometimes it forgets the conditions of the moment. We can ask hard questions without pretending the past had every tool we now wish it had. The investigators in Circleville had to face an unusual pattern of behavior. Anonymous letters are difficult enough. A long campaign of letters tied to personal allegations, family grief, a roadside device, and a later prison controversy is harder still. You can imagine the case file growing in uneven layers, with some pages crisp and official, others copied, clipped, or worn by handling. The file would not present itself as a clean mystery. It would present itself as an accumulation. Accumulation changes how people think. The first few facts may be examined closely. Later facts may be sorted into existing assumptions because the mind needs order. That is not laziness. It is human pattern making. In the Circleville case, once suspicion focused on Freshour, later facts may have been read in that light by some, while others later read the same facts against that conclusion. The file became a place where different patterns competed. Pattern making is helpful when it detects a real connection, and dangerous when it creates one. A detective must use pattern without being ruled by it. You and I can do the same as listeners. We notice the repeated letters, the repeated targets, the repeated questions. Then we ask what repetition proves and what it merely suggests. The difference is quiet, but it matters. The Circleville case rests on many such quiet differences. One of those differences is between knowing and believing. The writer often claimed to know. Recipients had to decide what to believe. Investigators had to determine what could be known. Later readers, including us, must separate all three. You can almost see the three words written on separate slips of paper. Knowing, believing, proving. They sit close together, but they are not the same. Much of the case's coldness lives in the spaces between them. And in those spaces, time kept moving, softening some edges and hardening others. Time softened voices. It made some witnesses less available and some memories less exact. It turned active fear into recollection and recollection into story. But time also hardened certain facts into the public record. The first letters began in 1977. Ron died in August of that year. The roadside sign appeared in January of 1983. Freshour was convicted in 1984. Letters continued while he was imprisoned. These facts became the bones of the case. Around those bones, people built different bodies of meaning. Some saw a case solved well enough by the conviction. Others saw a wrongful focus that left the true writer unnamed. Others stood somewhere in between, accepting parts of the official outcome while doubting the full explanation. You can let those positions exist without forcing a vote. The Circleville case is not changed by our certainty tonight. It is best approached by understanding why certainty has been so hard to sustain. The survival of the mystery also depends on the unusual nature of the letters themselves. Many old cases fade because the evidence is sparse or the public has little to grasp. Circleville offers something people can imagine vividly: an envelope, a block of handwriting, a message read at a kitchen table, a sign on a roadside. These images remain accessible. You can hold them in the mind, and because you can hold them, the unanswered question keeps returning. Yet accessible images can mislead. They make the case feel close enough to solve from a distance. A person reading online may feel, after a few pages, that the answer is obvious. But closeness in imagination is not closeness in evidence. You and I can remind ourselves of that gently. The people closest to the case lived with more context, not less, and still the question endured. That endurance deserves respect. Respect in this setting means not pretending that mystery itself is proof of any particular theory. The continued letters from prison are meaningful, but their meaning must be argued carefully. The traced firearm is meaningful, but its meaning depends on the path it traveled. The handwriting comparisons are meaningful, but their meaning depends on the reliability of the analysis and the quality of the samples. Every important fact has a hinge. The case turns on many hinges at once. You can hear those hinges in the quiet of the file, each one moving slightly as the night goes on. The night is a good time to read a case like this because the house around you becomes part of the work. A lamp warms the table. The room beyond the light grows dim. Paper sounds louder than it does in daylight. You can feel the edge of a folder against your wrist, and the slight dryness in the air. The Circleville case, with its letters and long pauses, seems to belong to that kind of hour. It asks for a reader who is not in a hurry. In that hour, the writer's anonymity feels less like an exciting secret and more like an absence that caused harm. We should keep returning to that. The unknown is not romantic. It is a blank place where accountability should be. The writer's refusal to sign meant others had to carry the burden of uncertainty. Mary carried it. Ron's family carried it. The town carried it. Investigators carried it in their files. Later readers carry it only lightly by comparison. That difference in burden matters. We can close the browser, set down the file, or drift to sleep. The people in Circleville could not set down the case so easily when it was active around them. A letter might arrive. A rumor might return. A name might be spoken again. The writer made ordinary moments uncertain, and that uncertainty belongs to real lives. Remembering that keeps the narration gentle. It keeps curiosity from becoming intrusion. There is a kind of patient compassion in admitting that a case may remain partly unresolved despite intense attention. It does not mean the work was worthless. Every preserved letter, every report, every testimony, and every later question has helped define the shape of what happened. The answer may not have fully arrived, but the harm was not allowed to vanish. You can feel the value of that. A file is also a form of witness. The Circleville file witnesses to a period when anonymous pressure entered a town through familiar channels. It witnesses to the limits of handwriting analysis and physical tracing. It witnesses to the complexity of family connections and public suspicion. It witnesses to the strange afterlife of a conviction that did not still every doubt. You can run your hand over the closed folder and sense how much it contains without becoming final. But the folder is not closed yet tonight, and the next page brings us to the question of why certain cases survive in public memory while others grow quiet. The Circleville case survives because it has a rhythm people remember. Letters arrive, a family is drawn in, a man dies after leaving home, a sign appears on a bus route, a suspect is convicted. Letters continue. The rhythm is simple enough to repeat, but the meaning remains difficult enough to debate. You can see how that combination keeps a case alive. If it were too simple, it would end. If it were too confusing, it might fade. Circleville sits in between. That in-between quality is especially powerful in sleep narration, because the mind can follow the pattern without needing sudden shock. We return to envelopes, roads, handwriting, and waiting. We return to the same questions. each time with slightly different light. The case itself becomes a slow-turning object on the table. You see one side, then another, and still the object remains the same. Its calm persistence is part of its hold. Public memory also keeps cases alive when they contain an apparent contradiction. Circleville has several: a visible campaign by an invisible writer, a conviction followed by continued letters, a small town where someone seemed to know much, but no one could prove enough, a case that feels solved in one narrow sense and unsolved in another broader sense. Contradictions ask the mind to keep working. Even a tired mind may return to them gently. The danger is that public memory can polish away nuance. It may make the writer seem almost omniscient when some knowledge may have been ordinary. It may make the investigation seem careless when the reality may have been constrained and complicated. It may make every suspect seem either entirely guilty or entirely wronged. You and I can refuse those clean extremes. The old file deserves more careful handling than that. Careful handling includes noticing the emotional economy of the letters. The writer spent very little material effort to create wide disruption. A sheet of paper, an envelope, a stamp, and a few minutes of writing could force hours of discussion, worry, and police work. That imbalance is part of what made the campaign effective. You can feel the unfairness in it, but also the investigative challenge. A small act can leave a large wake, and the wake can obscure the boat. In Circleville, the wake spread across years. Each letter disturbed the water again. By the time later investigators or readers looked back, the surface had been crossed by many ripples. Some led outward from the writer. Some came from public reaction. Some came from grief, rumor, anger, and fear. You can stand at the edge of that water with the file in your hands, watching the reflections move. The original point of disturbance is hard to see. That image brings us quietly back to the phrase, "went cold in plain sight," because plain sight can be full of movement. Movement does not always clarify. A busy street can hide a person better than an empty one. A town full of talk can hide the original source of a rumor. A file full of evidence can hide the absence of a final link. The Circleville case had movement everywhere. In mail routes, bus routes, court proceedings, prison years, and public retellings. Yet the one movement that mattered most, the handwriting the letters, remained unobserved in the way proof requires. If someone had seen the writer compose a letter, address it, and mail it, the case might have ended differently. If a letter had carried unmistakable trace evidence, the question might have narrowed. If a later confession had arrived, the uncertainty might have softened. Instead, the case left investigators with partial forms of visibility. You can see the paper, you can see the effects, you can see the people around it. The source remains just beyond the lamp. That just beyond quality is what keeps the file from resting. It is not a grand darkness. It is the familiar shadow at the edge of the desk, where the lamplight fades and ordinary objects lose their outlines. You know the room continues beyond what you can see. You simply cannot make out every shape. The Circleville case feels like that. It is near, domestic, legible in many parts, and still unfinished where it matters. A detective does not fight that shadow with drama. A detective moves the lamp a little, checks the page again, and asks a better question. What did the writer know that was truly private? Who had opportunity to send letters at the relevant times? Which letters are definitely connected, and which are only assumed to be? What evidence ties the roadside definitely connected, and which are only assumed to be? What evidence ties the roadside device to the letter writer, beyond the broader atmosphere of the case? Each question moves the light a little. Some questions may no longer be answerable. That is a hard, but necessary sentence. The person who knew may be gone. The evidence may be too worn. A memory may be too altered by time. A record may have been lost before anyone understood its value. You and I can accept that without turning away. Accepting limits is part of patient investigation. It prevents the mind from inventing certainty where the file has none. But accepting limits does not mean giving up attention, and the Circleville case continues to invite attention precisely because its limits are so visible. You can see the boundary around almost every major fact. The letters show intent, but not identity. The handwriting suggests comparison, but invites dispute. The firearm connects to a person, but raises questions of access and use. The prison letters challenge simplicity, but do not alone name an alternative writer. The town's knowledge suggests proximity, but does not prove a hand. These boundaries are not failures of reading. They are the real edges of the case. At those edges, different readers have made different choices. Some lean toward the conviction as the strongest anchor. Some lean toward the continued letters as the strongest doubt. Some look for hidden family conflict. Some look toward local rumor. Some focus on the limitations of document analysis. You can let those readers stand around the table with us, each holding a page, each pointing quietly to the part they find most important. The file remains larger than any one finger. The most patient approach may be to keep the case plural. Not plural in the sense of endless speculation, but plural in the sense that it contains several related questions. Who wrote the early letters? Who placed the roadside sign? Was the same person responsible for both? Who wrote the letters that came during Freshour's imprisonment? Were all the later letters authentic continuations? Which parts of the campaign belonged to one mind, and which may have changed over time? The file allows these questions to remain separate. Separating questions can reduce confusion. It prevents one answer from being stretched too far. A person might be responsible for one act and not another. A piece of evidence might solve one part and leave another part open. In the Circleville case, this distinction is especially important. The conviction addressed the roadside device. The public mystery has always stretched wider toward the authorship and continuation of the letters. You can feel the difference as two folders lying side by side. Those side-by-side folders may overlap, but they should not be merged carelessly. One contains physical construction, placement, and traceable materials. The other contains language, anonymity, and repetition. Where they overlap, the case becomes strongest or most difficult, depending on the evidence you trust. Where they separate, the case becomes colder. You and I keep them both open, turning from one to the other with the same measured breath. This measured breath is the opposite of the writer's pressure. The letters tried to force urgency, reaction, and fear. Our reading does not have to obey that rhythm. We can slow the case down, which is another way of taking power away from the anonymous voice. We can let the paper become evidence rather than command. We can let the people become people rather than targets. We can let the unknown remain quiet instead of loud. As the night settles further, the case begins to feel less like a demand for solution and more like a study in how communities, investigators, and families endure uncertainty over time. Endurance is not passive. It may look quiet from the outside, but it requires strength. Mary endured repeated intrusion. Families endured grief and suspicion. Investigators endured a case that resisted clean closure. A town endured the knowledge that someone among or near them had written with sustained malice. Later, readers endured the discomfort of not knowing which interpretation to trust. The Circleville case is built from these forms of endurance as much as from envelopes and ink. The endurance of investigators often receives less attention than dramatic breakthroughs, but in cold cases it matters deeply. Someone has to keep the file from disappearing. Someone has to answer a later inquiry. Someone has to know where the records are stored. Someone has to explain what was done and what could still be done. You can imagine a cold case unit with shelves of boxes, each one carrying a name, each one waiting for the right question or the right technology. Whether the Circleville case could benefit from any modern re-examination depends on what physical evidence remains and how it was preserved. That is a practical matter, not a magical one. Old envelopes, if kept under usable conditions, might hold possibilities, but decades of handling can limit what is possible. You and I should not promise answers from technology as if technology were a lantern that never dims. It is a tool, and tools need material they can work with. Still, the hope of re-examination is part of why old cases remain open in the mind. A forgotten print, a preserved adhesive edge, a better comparison method, a witness who finally speaks. These possibilities are small, but cold case work often lives on small possibilities. You can hear the quiet optimism in a drawer being opened again. Not excitement, not drama, just the steady belief that an old question deserves one more careful look. In Circleville, one more careful look usually returns to the same core difficulty. The case was never hidden from view. It unfolded publicly enough to become local law and national curiosity. Yet the exact authorship of the letters, across the full span of the campaign, remained out of reach. That is the cold center. It is not hidden under a floorboard. It is sitting in the middle of the room, unnamed. The unnamed center has shaped every retelling since. People circle it with timelines, theories, handwriting samples, and trial records. Some circle once and feel satisfied. Others circle for years. You and I circle gently tonight, not trying to force the center to speak, but trying to understand why it stayed silent. The paper is still. The lamp is low. The old question remains where it has been for so long. And now, as we turn another page, we come to the way a single anonymous voice can make an entire town listen for footsteps that may have been ordinary all along. A single anonymous voice can make an entire town listen for footsteps that may have been ordinary all along. And that is one of the quieter powers inside the Circleville case. You can imagine a person hearing a car slow near the road and wondering if it meant something, or noticing a neighbor at the post office and letting the thought pass through them before they could stop it. The letters did not only deliver accusations, they trained attention. They made ordinary movement feel charged. That trained attention can become exhausting. A town cannot stay alert forever, not at the same pitch, not through years of work, school, errands, and weather. People adapt because they have to. What once felt immediate begins to feel like part of the background, even if it remains unpleasant. You and I can see how this adaptation might help a case go cold. When everyone has heard the story many times, a new detail may sound old before anyone truly studies it. The Circleville writer seemed to benefit from that slow fatigue. At first, a letter could startle a household. Later, another letter might still matter, but it would arrive into a world already shaped by previous letters. The shock would be mixed with recognition. Recognition can be dangerous because it makes a pattern feel understood. You can picture someone opening an envelope and saying, in a tired voice, that it was another one. Another one may still contain evidence. Another one may still be important. Investigators know this problem well. Repetition can dull urgency even when repetition is the evidence. A campaign is proven by repeated acts, but repeated acts can begin to feel routine. The Circleville case required people to keep noticing the same kind of object without letting familiarity blunt their care. That is difficult work. It is like listening to a clock in a quiet room until the ticking disappears, then forcing yourself to hear each tick again. You can sit beside a detective doing exactly that, returning to letters that look similar enough to merge in memory. The detective separates them by date, by recipient, by postmark, by phrase, by paper, by envelope, by handwriting features. Each letter becomes itself again. The smell of old folders rises in the warm office air. The pages lie in careful stacks. The work is slow because the writer's power depended, in part, on making the letters blur together. The blur mattered beyond the evidence room. In public memory, the Circleville letters became a single thing, almost one long anonymous message stretched across years. But, for investigation, each letter had to be treated as an individual act. Who could have known this detail at this time? Who could have mailed it from this place? Did this wording appear before or after a certain event became public? You can feel the patience in those questions. They turn a fog back into droplets. And once the fog becomes droplets, the next task is to ask which ones truly came from the same cloud. The possibility of imitation sits quietly in the Circleville case, and it is easy to understand why. Once an anonymous writer becomes known, even locally, the style of the writing can become available to others. A phrase can be repeated, a tone can be copied, a cruel rhythm can be learned by someone who did not invent it. You and I should not say that imitation happened unless the evidence supports it, but we can see why investigators would have to consider it. Imitation complicates authorship. If every letter is assumed to come from the same hand, then the case may appear more unified than it is. If too many letters are treated as possibly separate, then the pattern may dissolve too easily. A careful investigator has to stand between those dangers. You can imagine them reading slowly, pencil hovering above the page, asking whether a particular letter belongs in the main file or in a smaller, uncertain pile beside it. The continued letters during Freshour's imprisonment make this question especially important. Were they the same writer continuing in a way investigators could not fully explain? Were they someone helping him? Were they someone copying the writer for reasons of their own? Or were some letters misattributed to the same campaign because the town had already learned to hear a particular voice? The Circleville case does not hand us an easy answer. It hands us a set of careful distinctions. Those distinctions are not merely technical. They change how we understand the harm. A single long campaign suggests one sustained intent. Multiple hands suggest contagion. The way one person's anonymous cruelty can teach another person to act. A mistaken grouping of letters suggests the way fear and pattern seeking can join separate events into one story. Each possibility carries a different human meaning. You can hold them one by one, like envelopes with different weights. The handwriting comparisons were meant, in part, to resolve that question of sameness. If the hand matched, the letters could be grouped more confidently. But handwriting, as we have said, is not a perfect instrument. It can suggest, support, challenge, or exclude, depending on quality and method. In the Circleville case, where so much rested on paper, the limits of paper analysis became central. You can almost see the magnified strokes, dark rivers of ink under glass. A person half asleep might wonder why this matters so much. It matters because the coldness of the case lives in the difference between resemblance and identity. Two letters may resemble each other. Two motives may resemble each other. But resemblance is not identity. You and I return to that gentle rule again and again because it keeps the file honest. It prevents the mind from turning likeness into proof too quickly. From imitation, the file leads us toward another quiet problem. The way the writer's own confidence may have made uncertain claims feel stronger than they were. The Circleville writer wrote with force, and force can imitate knowledge. A person who states something boldly may sound as if they know more than they do. The letters appear to have relied on that effect, pressing claims into the lives of Mary Gillispie, Gordon Massey, and others with a certainty that demanded attention. You can feel how that certainty might have worked on a recipient. The hand opens the envelope, the eyes move across the page, and the room changes. But investigators cannot let force become fact. They have to ask what the writer could genuinely know. Was the writer observing something directly, repeating gossip, inventing a claim, interpreting ordinary behavior through resentment? You can imagine those questions written in a margin, each one small but important. The Circleville case becomes less about whether the writer sounded certain and more about whether certainty had any foundation. This is where calm reasoning protects people. Anonymous writers often borrow authority from secrecy. They imply that because they are hidden, they see what others do not. But hiddenness can also conceal ignorance. A person may know only fragments and fill the gaps with accusation. You and I can feel the difference as we read. The writer's voice may be loud on the page, but loudness is not depth. It may only be pressure dressed as knowledge. That pressure was directed most clearly at Mary. In reading the case gently, we do not need to repeat the writer's words in detail, because the important fact is the repeated targeting itself. Mary's ordinary life became subject to anonymous review. Her work route, her family, and her reputation were pulled into a private theater the writer controlled from behind paper. You can picture the bus doors opening and closing, children settling into seats, and the driver carrying more than the morning route. The writer's focus on Mary also shaped how others were drawn in. Ron received letters. Gordon was named. Family members became part of the story. Investigators followed the lines outward. The writer may have intended to isolate, expose, or punish, but the result was wider confusion. You can feel how one accusation can become many burdens. It does not stay where the writer places it. It spreads through every relationship it touches. In this way, the Circleville case shows how anonymous accusation can create its own evidence-like atmosphere. People begin reacting to the claim, and their reactions may later be mistaken for proof that the claim had substance. A marriage strained by accusation may look like evidence of guilt, when it may be evidence of pressure. A defensive response may be read as suspicious, when it may be pain. You and I move carefully here because lives are not diagrams. The next page reminds us that the writer did not simply accuse, but watched for reaction, and that sense of being watched became one of the case's deepest shadows. Being watched changes behavior even when no one can prove anyone is watching. A person may close curtains earlier, choose a different route, speak more quietly, or scan a parking lot before getting into a car. In Circleville, the letters suggested knowledge of local movement, and that suggestion alone could alter how people felt in familiar places. You can imagine the sound of gravel under tires, the pale light of a porch bulb, and the faint unease of noticing what had always been there. The writer's apparent knowledge of Mary's bus route made the watching feel concrete. A school bus route is repetitive by design. It serves children, families, and schedules. Its predictability is a form of care. The roadside sign turned that predictability into vulnerability, and that is part of why the incident remains so important. You can feel the unfairness of using a caring routine as a way to reach someone. The case's sadness gathers around details like that. Investigators would have looked at who knew the route and who could place the sign without drawing notice. But knowing a school bus route may not be rare in a small community. Parents know, neighbors know, drivers see. People who live along rural roads become familiar with rhythms they never formally learn. This is one of the case's plain sight problems. The important knowledge may have been both specific and widely available. That makes the circle larger than comfort allows. Watching also does not have to mean constant surveillance. The writer may have relied on occasional observation, gossip, assumption, or prior knowledge. We do not know. But the effect on recipients could be the same. Once a person believes they are being watched, every ordinary detail may feel like confirmation. You and I can see how hard that would be to investigate, because perception and reality begin to braid together under pressure. A detective trying to unbraid them would ask what the writer knew before it could be public. That is a key question in many anonymous cases. Truly private details can narrow the field. Public details, even if presented dramatically, may not. In the Circleville case, where local gossip and daily routines overlapped, the boundary between private and public could become soft. The writer may have seemed closer than they were, or they may have been exactly as close as they seemed. The file does not let us choose easily, and so we keep both possibilities in view, like two photographs clipped to the same board. The first photograph shows a writer embedded in local life, close enough to know family tensions, bus routes, reputations, and town habits. This image fits the case in many ways. The letters carried a local feel, and the campaign seemed rooted in personal knowledge. You can picture someone moving through familiar streets, hearing names spoken, watching routines, and storing details for later use. The image is plausible, and for that reason, it has held many readers. The second photograph shows a writer whose knowledge was partly assembled, not deeply intimate. This person may have gathered gossip, watched from a distance, and turned fragments into claims that sounded more certain than they were. That image also fits some parts of the case. Anonymous letters do not require perfect knowledge to cause harm. They require enough knowledge to make recipients wonder what else the writer knows. You can feel how a fragment, used forcefully, can seem like a key. Between these photographs lies a third possibility, that the writer's knowledge changed over time. Early letters may have drawn from one source, later letters from another, or public discussion may have supplied details that later appeared to be inside information. The case's long duration makes this possibility worth holding. Over years, the writer could learn from the reactions the letters produced. The campaign itself may have become a source of information. That is a quietly unsettling thought, but it is also practical. Investigators would have had to account for that feedback. A letter sends a claim into the world. People respond, discuss, deny, confirm, speculate, or report. The writer may then incorporate what the world gives back. Over time, the writer's apparent knowledge grows, not because they began with all of it, but because the town's reaction teaches them. You can see how the case could become self-feeding. The file thickens, and the writer listens from somewhere beyond the page. This is another reason public attention can complicate an investigation. Publicizing a case may bring tips, but it may also give a writer more material, or encourage an imitator, or reshape witness memory. Detectives have to balance those outcomes carefully. In Circleville, the public nature of the letters made secrecy difficult from the beginning. The case did not wait quietly inside police files. It had already entered the town through mailboxes and conversation. That entry meant investigators were often working after the story had begun to tell itself. And once a story begins telling itself, it becomes another force in the room. The story of the Circleville case has a strong shape, which may be why it has lasted. But a strong story shape can make weaker details seem to fit. You can imagine a later reader encountering the case for the first time and feeling the pieces lock together emotionally, before they lock together evidentially. That feeling is natural. It is also something we have to watch. The mind likes patterns, especially at night, especially when the room is quiet and the story has rhythm. A detective has to be loyal to evidence before story. That loyalty can feel almost austere, but it is a form of care. It means not making Mary's experience prove more than it proves. It means not making Ron's death answer more than it answers. It means not making Freshour's conviction close more than it closes. It means not making the prison letters overturn more than they overturn. Each fact stays in its own shape. The file breathes better that way. You can practice that loyalty as you read. When a detail feels decisive, you set it down gently and ask what would need to be true for it to decide the matter. When a theory feels elegant, you ask which fact it leaves outside. When a suspect feels obvious, you ask whether obviousness comes from evidence or from repetition. These questions are not cold in the emotional sense. They are warm with restraint. They protect the people in the file. The Circleville case rewards that restraint because it contains so many tempting shortcuts. The convicted man must be the writer. The continued letters must prove he was not. The local gossip must identify the motive. The handwriting must settle the hand. Each shortcut offers rest, but only a shallow kind. The deeper rest comes from allowing the case to remain complex without becoming chaotic. You can feel that steadier rest in the slow turning of pages. Complex does not mean unknowable in every part. Some things are known. Letters were sent. Mary was targeted. Ron died after leaving home in August of 1977. A roadside sign and device were found on the 27th of January 1983. Freshour was convicted in 1984. Letters associated with the case continued during his imprisonment. These known things are the table. The unknown things are what sit upon it. As we sit at that table, the old distinction returns again between a case being legally addressed and a mystery being fully understood. The legal system addressed a part of the Circleville case when Freshour was tried and convicted. That process had its own rules, evidence, arguments, and outcome. A jury heard what was presented and reached a verdict. You can picture the formal stillness of a courtroom, the rustle of papers, the careful phrasing of questions, and the judge's voice controlling the pace. The law needs such rooms. It needs decisions, because society cannot leave every accusation permanently unresolved. But historical understanding is not bound to the same finality. People can revisit a case after trial, especially when new facts, continuing events, or persistent doubts remain. The Circleville case entered that second life because the letters did not behave as a closed case should have behaved in the public mind. They continued. They complicated. They asked readers to reconsider the relationship between the roadside device and the broader letter campaign. You can feel how the file kept refusing stillness. This does not mean the trial becomes irrelevant. It remains one of the largest structures in the case. Trial records, testimony, evidence, and conviction all have weight, but the public mystery also includes what happened outside that legal structure. The letters from prison, the long debate, the question of handwriting reliability, and the possibility of multiple hands all belong to that wider field. You and I move between courthouse and archive, letting each place speak in its own voice. The courthouse voice is formal. It asks whether the evidence meets a standard. The archive voice is quieter. It asks what can still be understood after time has passed. The family voice is different again. It asks what happened to us, and why. The town voice asks who among us knew. The public voice asks what makes this case so strange. The Circleville case contains all these voices, and none of them alone can carry the whole thing. A patient narrator, sitting beside you in the lamplight, has to let those voices remain distinct. We do not turn the family's pain into a puzzle. We do not turn the legal record into a footnote. We do not turn public curiosity into authority. We let the voices sound softly, one at a time, and then we return to the paper. The paper is where the case began, and paper remains its central texture. The texture matters. Old letters have weight, smell, brittleness, and the faint memory of hands. Even photocopies carry shadows of folds and pressure. The Circleville case is full of these surfaces, and surfaces are what investigators had. They did not have the writer sitting across the table. They had ink, paper, objects, statements, and consequences. You can feel how much work had to be done with materials that were both ordinary and stubbornly incomplete. From those materials, the case built a kind of archive, and archives have their own quiet way of preserving both knowledge and uncertainty. An archive does not solve by existing. It waits. It holds what was kept and exposes what was not. You can imagine a box with soft corners, a label written years ago, and folders arranged in a way that made sense to someone at the time. Inside are pages that may still matter, though the person who filed them has moved on. The Circleville case, like many cold cases, depends on such waiting. The file has outlasted the first urgency. Waiting changes evidence. Not physically only, though paper ages and ink may fade, but relationally. A statement made close to the time becomes more valuable as other memories blur. A preserved envelope becomes more precious as other envelopes disappear. A photograph becomes a window into a road or room that may no longer look the same. You can feel why archivists and evidence clerks matter. They hold open the possibility of later understanding. Yet waiting can also make evidence lonely. A report may sit for years without being read deeply. A box may be moved from shelf to shelf. A name may remain visible on a label while the person behind the name grows older or passes from the world. In the Circleville case, the file's survival is both comfort and sorrow. It means the case was not forgotten. It also means the answer did not come when it was most needed. Cold case units exist because of that sorrowful gap. They return to what was kept and ask whether old evidence can answer new questions. Sometimes it can. A preserved item yields a result. A witness speaks. A database finds a link. A method improves. But sometimes the return only clarifies the limits. You can imagine an investigator closing a folder gently, not defeated exactly, but aware that care does not always produce revelation. The work still matters. In Circleville, any later return must face the nature of the evidence. Anonymous letters are different from biological traces or recovered tools. They are language objects, social objects, and physical objects all at once. Their meaning depends on what they say, how they were made, how they moved, and how people responded. You cannot examine the ink without also thinking about the town. You cannot examine the town without returning to the ink. The case loops. Those loops can feel hypnotic, and perhaps that is why the Circleville case holds so many late-night readers. You follow one path and return to the beginning with a slightly different understanding. You follow another and return again. The file becomes a slow circle rather than a straight road. That may frustrate someone seeking an ending. But tonight, we are not rushing toward one. We are sitting with the circle, noticing how it was drawn. The circle was drawn in part by geography, so we turn again to the landscape around Circleville and Pickaway County. Landscape shapes a case in ways that are easy to overlook. Rural and small-town roads create both openness and privacy. A person may be visible from far away, but also unnamed. Just another vehicle near a field, or another figure near a mailbox. You can picture a pale road shoulder, a ditch holding winter water, and fields stretching beyond a line of fence posts. The Circleville case unfolded in a place where distance and familiarity lived side by side. Mary's school bus route belonged to that landscape. A bus route is a repeated path through community memory. Children know its sound, parents know its timing, drivers learn to wait behind it. The route becomes part of the morning. In the Circleville case, that routine was turned into part of the writer's apparent knowledge, and later into the sight of the roadside sign. You can feel how a repeated path can become both ordinary and vulnerable. The mail routes belong to the landscape too. Letters did not appear by magic. They moved along roads, through post offices, into hands, and out toward houses. Each envelope traveled physically through the same region of daily life. You can imagine a postal worker sorting mail without knowing that one piece would become part of a decades-long mystery. That ordinary blindness is built into systems. Most messages do not need scrutiny. The writer hid inside that normal grace. The courthouse and police offices were also part of the landscape, though of a different kind. They were places where private distress became public record. A person brought in a letter. An officer took a report. A document entered a file. You can hear the typewriter keys, the ringing phone, the quiet footsteps in a hallway. The case moved from home to office, from kitchen table to institutional drawer. Each move changed its texture. And then there were the homes, the most private parts of the map. Homes where letters were opened. Homes where family members spoke in low voices. Homes where suspicion may have sat at the table with dinner. The Circleville case cannot be understood only by roads and offices. It also belongs to living rooms, kitchens, bedrooms and porches. You and I do not enter those rooms intrusively. We acknowledge that they existed and that the case reached them. That reach is why the phrase "in plain sight" has a double meaning. The case was visible in public, but its deepest effects were often private. People could know about the letters without knowing what it felt like to receive one. They could know about the trial without knowing what it felt like to be named, suspected, or bereaved. Public visibility can hide private cost. The file reminds us of that softly. As we follow that private cost, we come again to the human need for explanation, which is one reason the case never quite leaves those who encounter it. Explanation helps people sleep. It lets the mind place an event on a shelf. This happened because of that. This person did this for that reason. The Circleville case withholds that kind of shelf for many readers. It offers facts, but not a final arrangement everyone can trust. You can feel the mind reaching, then settling back, then reaching again. That motion is gentle tonight, but for the people involved, it must have been deeply tiring. The writer's campaign attacked explanation itself. By hiding, the writer forced others to explain around an absence. People tried to explain the letters through motive, family connection, local rumor, handwriting, and physical evidence. Each explanation helped somewhat. None fully satisfied every part. You can imagine a table covered in labeled envelopes, each label clear, while the name of the writer remains blank. The blank label draws the eye, no matter how many other labels are filled. Human beings dislike blank labels. We fill them with theories, sometimes carefully, and sometimes too quickly. The Circleville case shows both impulses. Investigators filled the blank with a prosecuted theory connected to Freshour and the roadside device. Later doubters filled it with alternative possibilities. Public retellings sometimes fill it with atmosphere more than evidence. You and I try not to fill it beyond what the file allows. We let the blank remain visible. Letting the blank remain visible is not the same as indifference. It can be the most honest form of care. It says the people involved deserve truth, not just a satisfying answer. It says the record deserves accuracy, not decorative certainty. It says old pain should not be rearranged for neatness. You can feel that care in the slow pace of our reading. The Circleville case has been loud enough in other hands. Here, it can be quiet. The quiet does not erase the seriousness of the acts. Anonymous letters can be deeply harmful. A roadside device placed along a bus route is profoundly serious. A family death connected in time to the letters adds sorrow and gravity. We do not soften those facts by speaking calmly. We make room around them. Calm is not denial. Calm is a way of holding difficult material without letting it become spectacle. And as we make room, we begin to understand why the case's coldness is not a single failure, but an accumulation of conditions. The first condition is anonymity, simple and stubborn. The writer did not sign, did not appear, and did not offer a face to question. Every investigation had to work backward from effects. The second condition is time, because the campaign stretched across years and then decades of memory. The third is social overlap, because many people could know pieces of what the writer seemed to know. The fourth is evidentiary complexity, because letters, handwriting, and physical objects each carried different strengths and limits. The fifth condition is the conviction itself, which both answered and complicated. It gave the case a legal center, but the continuing letters made the broader public question whether the center held. The sixth condition is public memory, which preserved the case while also shaping it into a story. You can place these conditions like stones along a windowsill. None alone explains everything. Together, they show how a case can remain visible while the answer stays just out of reach. That kind of accumulation is hard to dramatize, which may be why it often gets reduced. But for patient detective work, accumulation is the real subject. Cases go cold through small losses, small delays, small uncertainties, and small assumptions that become large only when viewed across years. You can hear that truth in the low rustle of paper. The sound is slight, but it is made by many pages. The Circleville file is made the same way. If we were reviewing the case officially tonight, we might build separate charts. One for letters, one for recipients, one for dates and postmarks, one for known public events, one for physical evidence, one for Paul Freshour's timeline, one for Mary's route and relevant locations. You can imagine the wall filling slowly with careful notes, not dramatic red string, but plain cards pinned in straight lines. The work would be disciplined, quiet and long. Then we would ask where the charts overlap, which letters contain information not yet public, which recipients received letters before or after key events, which dates correspond to Freshour's known movements before imprisonment, which letters arrived while he was under restrictions, which physical items can be traced clearly, which claims in the letters were ever independently confirmed. Each question would require patience. Each answer might be partial. Partial answers are still answers. A cold case investigator learns to value them. They may not name the writer, but they can narrow a date range, exclude a possibility, clarify a timeline, or correct a rumor. In the Circleville case, even small clarifications matter, because the public story has carried so many versions. You and I can appreciate the humble power of a corrected date or a properly separated claim. Accuracy is quiet, but it holds. And because accuracy holds, we keep returning to the distinction between what the writer wanted to be true and what the evidence shows. The writer wanted to create a world where their claims mattered because they were repeated. Evidence asks for something different. It asks for support outside the writer's own voice. This difference is central to the Circleville case. The letters were not neutral witnesses. They were acts. They were attempts to influence, shame, frighten, or control. You can feel why investigators could not simply mine them for truth without also studying them as behavior. When an anonymous letter names a person, the name becomes part of the investigation, but it also becomes part of the harm. A detective must examine the claim while resisting the writer's attempt to define the target. That is delicate work. You and I can see how easily a case can become organized around the writer's obsessions. The writer points, and everyone looks. But patient investigation also asks who is doing the pointing and why the pointing began. In Circleville, the writer pointed repeatedly at Mary and Gordon. They tried to make that alleged relationship the center, yet the lasting mystery has become the writer's identity and the mechanisms of the campaign. That shift matters. It moves attention from the people targeted to the person doing the targeting. It refuses to let anonymous accusation control the moral center of the case. The file, read patiently, gradually turns toward the hand holding the pen. The hand holding the pen remains unknown in the broad public sense, even after all these years of discussion. That does not mean every investigator or local observer lacked an opinion. Many surely had strong views, but an opinion, even a well-informed one, is not the same as a resolved historical fact. You can feel how often the Circleville case rests on that distinction. Strong views gather around weak joints. The case remains uneasy. Uneasy cases are often the ones people revisit, not because they are the most dramatic, but because they teach something about the limits of knowing. The Circleville case teaches that an answer can be close socially and distant evidentially. It teaches that a town can be saturated with a mystery, while proof remains thin in the crucial place. It teaches that a legal outcome may coexist with a wider, unsettled narrative. Those lessons are quiet, but they linger. They linger like the smell of old paper after a box has been opened, faint but persistent, following you even after the pages are set down. That smell of old paper brings us back to the physical archive once more, and to the possibility that somewhere in a stored page, a small overlooked detail may still wait. It may be nothing as grand as a confession. It might be a date, a phrase, an envelope mark, or a connection between two letters that has not been fully appreciated. Cold case work often advances through such modest recoveries. You can imagine a detective noticing one small inconsistency and sitting a little straighter. But modest recoveries require access and context. A mark on an envelope means little without knowing when it was collected and how it was handled. A phrase means little without comparing it to earlier and later letters. A witness statement means little without its date and circumstances. The Circleville case reminds us that evidence is relational. Each item draws meaning from its neighbors. You cannot pull one page from the box and expect it to speak entirely alone. That is why the whole archive matters. Even the dull parts, receipts, logs, chain of custody notes, interview summaries, court transcripts, and old correspondence may seem less memorable than the letters themselves. Yet they provide the frame. They tell us how the memorable pieces entered the record. You can hear the steady discipline of that work, the turning of pages that do not sparkle but support everything. In patient detective work, dull pages often carry the flaw. The flaw in the Circleville case has always been uneven. Some areas feel firm, others creak. A careful reader learns where to step lightly. The roadside device and trial records create one firm area, though debated. The continued letters create a creaking area under any simple conclusion. The early anonymous campaign spreads across both, sometimes firm in fact, sometimes foggy in interpretation. You and I walk slowly because the old house of the case deserves care. Walking slowly also means resisting the desire to make the writer more clever than the evidence shows. Anonymous offenders can seem brilliant simply because they were not identified. But sometimes remaining hidden depends less on brilliance than on ordinary opportunity, limited technology, social complexity, and luck. The Circleville writer may have been calculating, but the case's coldness may also reflect the conditions around the writing. You can hold both thoughts. Neither needs to dominate. That matters because myth can protect the unknown. If the writer becomes a figure of almost impossible cunning, the practical investigation fades. We begin admiring the mystery instead of examining it. The Circleville case does not need that myth. It is more human, and therefore more troubling. If the writer was simply someone who knew enough, wrote often enough, and moved through ordinary systems without leaving enough proof, plain sight, again, becomes the hiding place. And plain sight brings us to the soft routines of the town, the routines that kept absorbing the case even as they revealed its reach. A school bus route is a routine. Mail delivery is a routine. Court proceedings have routines. Prison mail has routines. Family gatherings have routines. The Circleville case passed through all of them. Each routine offered structure, and each structure had gaps. A route can be predicted. Mail can be anonymous. Court can decide one charge without resolving every surrounding question. Prison can restrict a person while still leaving debate over communication. Routines both hold and fail. You can imagine investigators studying those routines like maps. Where did Mary drive each morning? Where were the mailboxes and post offices? What was Freshour's schedule before arrest? And later, what were the controls around him in prison? Who visited whom? Who knew which addresses? These questions are not dramatic, but they are the bones of the work. A case like Circleville is investigated through calendars, roads, habits, and access. Access is one of the quietest words in any case file. Who had access to the weapon? Who had access to the route? Who had access to family information? Who had access to mailing opportunities? Who had access to the emotional knowledge needed to wound? You can see the word written again and again in the margin. Access does not prove action, but action usually needs access. The challenge is that in a small community, access may spread widely. Opportunity is access placed in time. A person may know something but lack the chance to act on a specific day. Another may have the chance but lack the knowledge. A good timeline tries to bring these together. In the Circleville case, the long duration created many opportunities for many people, while the specific roadside event narrowed attention sharply. That contrast gives the file much of its shape. Broad letters, narrow device, broad doubt again. Motive is the third word, but motive is softer than access and opportunity. It can be hidden, invented, misread, or shared by more than one person. The writer's motive may have seemed obvious to the writer and opaque to everyone else. It may have changed as the campaign continued. You and I treat motive as a candle, not a floodlight. It illuminates nearby things, but it cannot be asked to light the whole case alone. Means, access, opportunity, motive. These are familiar investigative words, but in the Circleville case they do not form a simple square. They overlap, blur, and shift across years. A person might have means for letters, but not for the roadside device. Another might have access to a device, but not motive for the full campaign. Another might have motive, but no known connection to key evidence. The old file asks us to keep sorting without forcing symmetry. And as we sort, the night deepens, and the letters seem less like messages than like footprints left across a floor that many people later crossed. Footprints in a busy room are hard to isolate. The first marks may be clear, but later movement scuffs them. The Circleville letters worked this way in public memory. The writer left marks, and then fear, rumor, investigation, trial, media, and debate moved over the same floor. By the time later readers arrived, the original path was still present but partly crossed by many others. You can see why the case remains so difficult to trace cleanly. Media attention is one of those later crossings. It helped preserve the case and bring it to wider awareness. It also turned the case into a story with selected scenes, because every retelling must choose. Some choices clarify, others simplify. You and I are choosing too, even in this slow narration. The difference is that we are trying to show the file's uncertainty rather than hide it. We are letting the missing places remain visible in the lamplight. When the case reached larger audiences, it gained new readers, new theories, and new emotional energy. That can be useful. Someone may remember something. Someone may come forward. Public attention can keep an old case from being forgotten. But it can also create noise. Tips may repeat rumors. Theories may harden without evidence. People far from the case may speak with more certainty than those who lived near it. The Circleville case has carried both benefits and burdens. A calm retelling can act almost like a dust cloth, not changing the furniture, only revealing its shape more clearly. We move over the known facts slowly. We do not scrub away ambiguity. We simply remove some of the glare. The letters began in 1977. Ron died that August. The roadside sign appeared in January of 1983. Freshour was convicted in 1984. Letters continued during his imprisonment. The broad authorship question endured. The facts sit quietly. Once the glare lowers, the case feels less like a riddle and more like a long human failure to reach complete accountability. That is a sadder view, but a truer one. The unknown writer, or writers, created harm and left others to carry the uncertainty. Investigators did some work, courts did some work, families endured, and the public kept asking. Still, the clean answer did not settle over every part. You can feel the weight of that incompletion. We do not need to make that weight heavier than it is. We only need to acknowledge it as we continue through the file, because the next portion asks us to sit with the long afterlife of Paul Freshour's conviction. Paul Freshour's conviction became a dividing line in the Circleville case. Before it, The investigation moved toward identifying and prosecuting someone connected to the roadside device. After it, the case entered a stranger phase, because the letters associated with the writer did not simply disappear in the way many expected. You can imagine the uneasy feeling that would create among people following the case. A line had been drawn, but ink kept appearing beyond it. Freshour maintained that he had not written the letters and had not placed the device. From prison, his claim of innocence became part of the case's public afterlife. A convicted person's denial is not unusual by itself, but in this case the continued letters gave the denial a different setting. You and I can see why later readers return to that point so often. It does not prove everything, but it refuses to let the story rest easily. The prison environment also raises practical questions. What access did Freshour have to writing materials, outgoing mail, visitors, and outside contacts? What controls were in place? Could letters have been sent in a disguised way? Could someone outside have written independently? The answers depend on records and conditions, not assumption. You can imagine a detective requesting logs, mail procedures, visitor lists, and dates, then comparing them with letters. The work would be slow and administrative. Administrative work can be revealing, though it rarely feels cinematic. A date stamp, a mailroom rule, a visitor entry, or a restriction note might strengthen or weaken a theory. The Circleville case, like many old investigations, may turn less on grand revelation than on such plain documents. You can smell the toner on copies, feel the thinness of prison forms, and hear the low buzz of an office machine. The truth, if it appears, may arrive in dull clothing. Freshour's release in 1994 added another marker to the timeline. Accounts often note that the threatening letters appear to have stopped around that era, a fact that some find suggestive and others treat cautiously. Timing can be meaningful, but it can also mislead. A thing stopping near another thing does not always mean one caused the other. You and I place the timing on the table and let it remain visible without making it speak beyond its strength. The conviction, the prison letters, and the timing after release form one of the case's most debated triangles. Each point pulls on the others. If Freshour was the writer, the prison letters need explanation. If he was not the writer, the roadside evidence and conviction need explanation. If there were multiple writers or helpers, the whole campaign becomes more complex. You can feel the triangle turning slowly in the lamplight, never quite lying flat. That turning brings us toward a broader question, the difference between stopping a campaign and understanding it. A campaign can stop for many reasons. The writer may die, age, lose interest, feel satisfied, feel afraid, become unable, or decide the risk is too high. Another person may intervene. Circumstances may change. Public attention may alter the calculation. In the Circleville case, the apparent end of threatening letters around the time Freshour re-entered free life has been read in different ways, but it does not by itself identify the full cause. Stopping is an event, understanding is harder. When a harmful act stops, people often feel relief before they feel clarity. Relief is practical. It lets the body unclench. It lets a family move through the day with less immediate fear. But relief can leave the question intact. Who did this? Why did it happen? Could it have been prevented? Was the right person held responsible? You can feel how those questions might remain even after the mailbox becomes ordinary again. Ordinary again is a tender phrase in this case. To open mail without bracing. To drive a route without scanning for signs. To hear a phone ring without connecting it to old fear. Such ordinary moments are not small to people who have lost them. The Circleville case asks us to value ordinary peace because the writer interfered with it for so long. You and I can let that recognition settle softly over the file. Investigators may measure a case by evidence and outcomes, but people living through it measure it by days. A day without a letter, a day without a rumor, a day when work feels like work again. The case file cannot fully record those measures. It notes incidents, reports, and proceedings. It may not note the first quiet morning after a long period of fear, yet that morning matters. It is part of the human story around the evidence. The unknown writer, by contrast, left behind no accountable explanation. That absence means the people affected had to make meaning without the person who caused the harm ever taking responsibility in a way the public record could fully accept. You can feel the quiet unfairness of that. Cold cases often leave families and communities with this burden. They must live with consequences while the cause remains partly unnamed, and so the Circleville letters case does not close in the clean way a listener might hope for. Paul Freshour was convicted for the attempted booby trap connected to one of the signs, and he served years in prison while continuing to deny that he was the writer. But the wider mystery of who wrote the letters, who knew what, and whether one person or more than one person carried that campaign forward has never been fully resolved. The identity of the Circleville letter writer remains officially unknown, and the case is still remembered as unsolved. That is the quiet place where the record leaves you, not with a confession that explains every page, and not with a final answer that gathers all the loose threads and ties them neatly together, but with a town that kept going after being watched, accused and frightened from the shadows. The roads were still driven, the mail was still delivered, children still went to school, people still passed one another in stores and at stop signs, and in the small ordinary spaces where trust matters most, even when trust has been strained. Over time, the sharp edges of the story softened into memory, but they did not disappear. They became part of the way people spoke about the place, part warning, part puzzle, part sorrow, and maybe that is why the case lingers. It is not only because of the strange handwriting, or the threats, or the questions around guilt and innocence. It lingers because it shows how much damage can be done by a hidden voice, and how deeply people need the simple dignity of knowing who harmed them, and why. For now, the letters remain behind us like pages left in a darkened room, their words no longer moving through the town with the same force, but still present in the archive, still waiting without answer. And as you let the story settle, you can leave Circleville in the quiet that came after, with its streets emptied for the night, its windows dark, and its unanswered mail resting silently in the past.